Assalamu alaikum Nazreen. The horses carried them through the breaking dawn like arrows loosed from a bow that had been drawn too long. The road to Bursa was not a single road but many, winding through valleys where morning mist clung to the earth like the breath of sleeping giants, cutting through forests where ancient oaks stood like sentinels posted by time itself, crossing rivers whose waters ran cold and clear and indifferent to the affairs of men who bled and fought and died upon their banks. Orhan Sahib rode at the front. His eyes were fixed upon the horizon, but his mind was behind him, still inside the walls of the Kanka, still standing in that dim room where Shahanshah sat like a man whose soul had been extracted through his eyes and replaced with nothing but dust and silence. Sporcha had not spoken since they left. She sat behind him on the horse, her arms locked around his waist, her face pressed against the space between his shoulder blades, and she breathed. That was all she did. She breathed, and each breath carried something out of her that she would never get back, some fragment of the hope she had carried into that Kanka, some shard of the belief that she could save everyone she loved if only she was brave enough, if only she was fast enough, if only she was willing to sacrifice enough. She had been brave, she had been fast, she had sacrificed. And still her father sat in that chair, staring at that wall, unreachable, unreturnable, a man who was alive only in the most technical and meaningless sense of the word. Evernos rode to Orhan Sahib's right, slightly behind, as was his custom. He never rode beside his sultan. He always rode just far enough back that he could watch Orhan Sahib's flanks without being asked, just close enough that he could throw himself between his sultan and danger without needing to close a gap. This was not training, this was instinct. This was the product of years spent in the service of a man he loved more than he loved his own life, a man he would follow into the fire itself if the order was given, and even if it was not. Fatima rode on the left. Her short sword was sheathed, but her hand never left the pommel. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the tree line, the ridges, the shadows between rocks, the spaces where ambush lived and waited and breathed. She had learned long ago that safety is an illusion, that the moment you believe you are safe is the moment the blade finds your back. She had learned this not from books or teachers but from the world itself, from the scars on her arms and the memories burned into her mind like brands pressed into living flesh. Behind them rode Shamal and Tamir Boga and Mustafa and Ayaz and the soldiers, a column of mounted warriors moving with the disciplined silence of men who understood that the distance between them and the Shahzada's pursuit was measured not in miles but in minutes. Every moment they wasted was a moment given to the enemy. Every pause was a gift wrapped in the ribbon of their own destruction. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Tamir Boga brought his horse forward and said to Evernos, "We should send scouts ahead. If the Shahzada has riders already on the road, we will ride straight into their arms." Evernos nodded. He called Mustafa and said, "Take 2 men, ride ahead, fast. If you see anything at all, a dust cloud, a glint of metal, a horse track that should not be there, turn back and report. Do not engage, do not be seen. Go." Mustafa selected 2 riders and the 3 of them broke from the column and surged forward, their horses leaping into the morning light like hawks released from the fist. Within moments they were gone, swallowed by the road and the mist and the distance. Orhan Sahib did not watch them go. He had given Evernos the authority to manage the tactical details of their movement, and he trusted Evernos the way a man trusts the ground beneath his feet, completely unconsciously, without reservation. His mind was elsewhere. His mind was in Bursa, where a reckoning awaited him that would test not his sword arm but something far more vulnerable, his heart. He thought of Malhan Khatun. He thought of the way she would look at him when he returned, not with anger, for Malhan did not waste her energy on anger, with something worse. With that quiet, penetrating gaze that could reach inside a man and find the exact nerve he was trying to protect and press upon it with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a stone. She would want to know everything. She would want to know why Sporcha had fled. She would want to know why the children had helped her. She would want to know what had happened in the Kanka and what had not happened and what should have happened and what might yet happen. And she would want answers that were true, not answers that were comfortable, because Malhan Khatun had never in her life accepted comfort as a substitute for truth. He thought of Qasim, that boy, that fierce, stubborn, reckless boy who reminded Orhan Sahib so much of himself at the same age that it frightened him. Qasim had helped Sporcha escape. Qasim had looked at a woman in distress and decided that the rules did not apply, that obedience could be set aside when compassion demanded it, that doing what felt right was more important than doing what he was told. And the terrible thing, the thing that Orhan Sahib could not say aloud to anyone, not to Malhan, not to Evernos, not even to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts, the terrible thing was that Qasim had not been entirely wrong. The boy's instinct had been correct even if his method had been disastrous. Sporcha had needed help. Sporcha had needed to reach her father, and Qasim had seen that need and responded to it with the only tools available to a child: disobedience, improvisation, and love. But Orhan Sahib could not reward that. He could not praise it. He could not even acknowledge it without undermining the very structure of authority and discipline that held his household and his empire together. A leader who allows his children to disobey whenever their hearts tell them to is a leader whose authority rests on sand, and empires built on sand do not survive the first storm. He would have to punish them. He would have to look into Qasim's eyes, those defiant, wounded, beautiful eyes, and tell him that what he did was wrong, and Qasim would not understand. Qasim would look at him with the bewilderment of a child who saved a life and was punished for it, and in that look would be a question that has haunted every father since the beginning of time. Why is doing the right thing wrong? And Orhan Sahib did not have an answer, not one that would satisfy a child, not one that would satisfy himself. They rode on. The sun climbed higher, the mist burned away. The world revealed itself in the harsh, unforgiving light of mid-morning, and in that light every shadow became sharper, every edge became clearer, and the road to Bursa stretched before them like a sentence that had been written but not yet completed, its final words still hidden behind the curve of the next hill, the turn of the next bend, the fall of the next shadow. It was then that Mustafa returned. He came riding hard from the north, his horse lathered and blowing, his face tight with urgency. He pulled up beside Evernoz and reported in sharp, clipped phrases, "The road ahead is clear for the next 3 leagues, no sign of the Shahzada's men, but there is something else. A caravan stopped at the crossroads near the river, merchant wagons, but they are not merchants." Evernoz asked, "How do you know?" Mustafa said, "Because merchants do not carry military-grade crossbows hidden beneath their grain sacks, and merchants do not post sentries on the ridgeline above their camp, and merchants do not wear armor beneath their cloaks." Evernoz turned to Orhan Sahib and relayed the information. Orhan Sahib listened without expression, then he asked, "How many?" Mustafa said, 30, perhaps 35, well-armed, well-positioned, they are waiting for someone. Orhan Sahib said, "They are waiting for us." Evernoz said, "The Shahzada could not have sent men ahead of us this quickly. He did not know we were coming this way. He did not even know we had escaped until after we were already riding." Orhan Sahib said, "Then these men were not sent by the Shahzada. They were already here, already positioned, already waiting, which means someone knew we would take this road, someone who knows our routes, someone who knows our patterns, someone who has been watching us long enough to predict our movements." The column slowed. The horses sensed the change in their riders' mood, the sudden tension that ran through the reins like an electric current, and they tossed their heads and stamped their hooves and shifted uneasily beneath their saddles. Fatima said, "Andreas." Orhan Sahib looked at her. She said it again, "Andreas. He has agents everywhere. He has been building his network for years. He does not rely on the Shahzada's army alone. He has his own people, his own soldiers, his own assassins. If anyone could have positioned men on this road before we even left the Konka, it is him." Orhan Sahib considered this. He said, "If these are Andreas's men, then they are not here to delay us. They are here to kill us. Andreas does not capture. Andreas does not negotiate. Andreas eliminates." Tamir Boga said, "Then let us eliminate them first. We have enough fighters. We have the element of surprise. They think they are the hunters. Let us show them what it means to be the prey." Shamal said, "If we go around them, we lose half a day, and half a day might be enough for the Shahzada's pursuit to catch us." Evernoz said, "If we fight them, we risk casualties. We are already few. Every man we lose is a man we cannot replace before the next battle." Orhan Sahib raised his hand. The discussion stopped. He closed his eyes for a moment. Behind his eyelids, the map of the terrain unfolded like a scroll. He saw the river. He saw the crossroad. He saw the ridgeline where the sentries were posted. He saw the wagons and the hidden crossbows and the men beneath their merchant disguises. And he saw the gaps, because there are always gaps. In every formation, every trap, every ambush, there are gaps. The art of war is not the art of destroying your enemy. It is the art of finding the gaps your enemy does not know he has left. He opened his eyes and said, "Shamal, take 5 men, circle west, cross the river upstream where the trees give cover, come around behind their position on the ridgeline. When you hear my signal, take the sentries, quietly, before they can warn the camp." Shamal nodded. Orhan Sahib continued, "Tamir Boga, take 10 men, approach from the east, use the dry creek bed for cover. Position yourselves within arrow range of the wagons, but do not attack until the sentries are down and my signal is given." Tamir Boga nodded. His eyes gleamed with the anticipation of a man who had been denied violence for too long and was about to be reunited with his oldest companion. Orhan Sahib said, "Evernoz, you and Fatima will ride with me. We will approach from the road, openly, like travelers, like the very prey they expect us to be." Fatima said, "Bait." Orhan Sahib said, bait with teeth. Evernos said, in Esporcha. Orhan Sahib looked back at his wife. Esporcha met his gaze. She said, do not even think of asking me to hide in the trees like a child, Orhan. I have been hiding for too long. I am done hiding. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, stay behind us, stay on the horse. If the fighting starts, ride north, do not stop, do not look back. She said, I will not leave you. He said, I am not asking you to leave me, I am asking you to survive, there is a difference. She held his gaze, then she nodded, once barely. They split. Shamal and his 5 men peeled off to the west and vanished into the tree line like smoke dissolving into air. Tamir Boga and his 10 fighters moved east, dropping down into the dry creek bed one by one, their horses left behind, their weapons drawn, their bodies low and fast and utterly silent. Within minutes the main column had reduced to just Orhan Sahib, Evernos, Fatima, Esporcha, Ayaz, and 3 additional soldiers. 8 people on horseback, riding toward a trap that contained 35 armed killers. They rode slowly now, deliberately. Orhan Sahib adjusted his posture, slouching slightly in the saddle, letting his sword hang loose at his hip, allowing his horse to amble rather than march. He looked to any observer like a tired traveler on a long road, a man thinking of nothing more dangerous than the meal that awaited him at his destination. Evernos followed his lead. He loosened his grip on his reins. He let his shoulders drop. He even hummed, a low, tuneless drone that sounded like a man trying to keep himself awake during a boring journey. But beneath that humming, beneath that relaxed facade, his muscles were coiled like springs and his eyes were counting the men on the ridgeline 2, 3, 4 sentries and the men among the wagons 20, 25, perhaps 30 in the camp itself, and the crossbows, at least 6 visible, hidden beneath canvas and grain sacks and piled blankets. They rounded the final bend and the crossroads came into view. The wagons were arranged in a loose semicircle near the river bank. A cooking fire burned in the center, sending a thin column of smoke into the sky. Men sat around the fire, eating, talking, laughing. They looked at first glance exactly like what they pretended to be, merchants resting during a long journey, harmless, unremarkable, forgettable. But Orhan Sahib saw what others would not. He saw that their laughter was too loud, performed for the benefit of anyone watching. He saw that their eating was theatrical, forks raised too high, mouths opening too wide, the pantomime of men who were focused not on their food but on the road. He saw that their positions around the fire were not random but tactical, each man angled to spring in a specific direction, each man within arm's reach of a weapon that was technically out of sight but practically available in less than a second. And he saw the leader, a man sitting slightly apart from the others on a low stool near the largest wagon, his back against the wheel, his legs stretched out before him, his hat pulled low over his eyes as though he were dozing. But beneath that hat Orhan Sahib knew were eyes that missed nothing. This was a man who had planned ambushes before. This was a man who understood patience. This was a man who knew that the most dangerous moment in any trap is not the springing of it but the waiting before. Orhan Sahib raised his hand in greeting as they approached. He called out in a voice that carried the perfect blend of weariness and friendliness. Peace upon you, travelers. We have ridden long and our horses need water. May we share your fire. The leader pushed his hat up. He looked at Orhan Sahib. He looked at Evernos. He looked at Fatima, who had pulled a scarf over her face in the manner of a modest traveler's wife. He looked at Esporcha. He counted 8 riders. He had 35 men. The mathematics of violence were clearly in his favor. He smiled and said, of course, brother. The road is long and the river is generous. Come rest, you are welcome. They dismounted, or rather Orhan Sahib, Evernos, and Fatima dismounted. Esporcha remained on the horse, which Ayaz held by the bridle, positioned slightly back from the group near the edge of the road, angled toward the north. Escape position, ready to run. Orhan Sahib walked toward the fire. He walked casually, his hands visible, his sword swinging gently at his hip, his body language broadcasting harmlessness with the skill of a man who had survived 100 encounters exactly like this one. He sat down near the fire and accepted a wooden cup of water from one of the men and drank and said, thank you, brother. Where are you heading? The leader said, south to the markets at Iznik, grain and cloth, and you. Orhan Sahib said, north, to Bursa, family matters. The leader nodded. He said, Bursa, beautiful city. I hear the new governor is making changes. Orhan Sahib said, governors come and go, the city remains. The leader smiled again, but the smile did not reach his eyes. It never reached his eyes, because the eyes were doing something else entirely. The eyes were communicating. Orhan Sahib caught it, a flicker, a glance, the leader's gaze sliding to the left for half a heartbeat, touching one of the men near the wagons, and that man's hand moving, almost imperceptibly, toward the canvas covering the nearest crossbow. Orhan Sahib set down his cup. He looked at the leader and said, in a voice that had changed completely, that had dropped every pretense of warmth and weariness and become something that sounded like the hiss of a blade being drawn from its sheath, "How long has Andreas been paying you?" The leader's smile vanished, the camp froze, every man stopped moving, every hand went to a weapon. The air itself seemed to solidify as though the molecules between them had turned to iron. The leader said, "I do not know what you are talking about." Orhan Sahib said, "You know exactly what I am talking about. You have been sitting here for days, watching this road, waiting for someone. You were told what we look like. You were told which direction we would come from. You were told to make it look natural. A merchant caravan, harmless, inviting, and when we came close enough, when we were inside your circle, you would spring the trap. Crossbows first from the wagons, then swords, quick, efficient, total." He paused, the silence was absolute. Then he said, "But you were not told who you would be facing. Andreas told you we were fugitives, refugees, easy prey. He did not tell you that you would be facing the Sultan of the Kayı. He did not tell you that the man sitting across from you at this fire has broken sieges and shattered armies and walked through walls of steel and flame and come out the other side carrying the banner of Islam in his bloody hands. He did not tell you that, because if he had told you that, you would not be here. You would be somewhere far, far away from this road, thanking Allah that you had never been foolish enough to accept this contract." The leader's hand tightened on the handle of the dagger at his belt. His jaw worked, his mind calculated, and what it calculated was not favorable. He had 35 men, he had the numbers, but the man across from him had something that numbers cannot defeat: certainty. The absolute, unshakable, terrifying certainty of a man who has already accepted the possibility of his own death and has therefore become immune to the fear of it. And then from the ridgeline above there was a sound, a soft sound, the sound of a body hitting the ground, then another, then another. The sentries one by one were dropping. Shamal and his men had reached them. The eyes of the ambush were being blinded. The leader heard it, he looked up, he saw nothing, but he felt it. He felt the shift. He felt the balance of power tilting beneath his feet like a ship listing in a storm. Orhan Sahib said, "Your sentries are dead, your ridgeline is ours, and behind those wagons, coming through the creek bed to the east, are 10 of my best fighters, each one of whom has killed more men than you have ever met. You are surrounded, you are outnumbered, and you are out of time." The leader looked at him, the calculation in his eyes changed. The mathematics of violence had reversed. Orhan Sahib said, "You have two choices. Drop your weapons and tell me everything Andreas has planned. Or fight and die here on this road where no one will remember your name and no one will mourn your passing and no one will even bother to bury your bones. They will lie here until the dogs come, and the dogs will come." The leader's hand trembled on his dagger. He looked left, he looked right. He saw his men looking back at him, waiting for an order, waiting for a decision, waiting for leadership. And he saw in their eyes the same thing Orhan Sahib had seen, the dawning realization that they had been lied to, that they had been sent to kill a man who could not be killed, that they had been used as disposable instruments by a puppet master who would not shed a single tear when he learned of their destruction. The leader's hand released the dagger. He raised both hands, palms outward, and said, in a voice that had been stripped of every pretense and every ounce of bravado, "We surrender." One by one his men followed. Swords dropped into the dust. Crossbows were uncovered and laid upon the ground. Daggers were removed from boots and belts and sleeves and placed in piles beside the wagons. 35 armed killers became 35 unarmed men standing in the morning light with empty hands and full fear. Tamir Boga emerged from the creek bed with his men. He walked into the camp with his battle axe resting on his shoulder like a farmer carrying a hoe, casual, unhurried, utterly terrifying. He looked at the surrendered men and then looked at Orhan Sahib and said, "Shall I tie them or bury them?" Orhan Sahib said, "Tie them, we have questions." Shamal came down from the ridgeline with his 5 men. He reported 4 sentries neutralized, none killed, all knocked unconscious and bound. Orhan Sahib nodded his approval. He said, "Good, dead men cannot answer questions, unconscious men can be woken." They gathered the prisoners in the center of the camp, near the fire that still burned, its smoke rising into the morning sky like a signal that no one had intended to send. Orhan Sahib stood before them and looked at the leader and said, "Your name?" The leader said, "Darius." Orhan Sahib said, "Darius, you were hired by Andreas to ambush us on this road. How did he know we would be here?" Darius hesitated, then he said, "He has spies everywhere, in your camp, in your court, in your army. He knows your movements before you make them. He knew you would go to the Konka. He knew you would take the northern road back to Bursa. He knew how many men you would bring. He knew everything." Orhan Sahib's jaw tightened. A spy, in his camp, in his court, in his army. The words landed upon him like blows from an invisible fist, each one harder than the last, each one driving deeper into the core of his trust, his judgment, his ability to distinguish ally from enemy, friend from traitor. He asked, "Who is the spy?" Darius shook his head. He said, "I do not know. Andreas does not share that kind of information with hired men. He gives us targets and routes and timelines. He does not give us names. He protects his sources the way a snake protects its venom, by keeping it hidden until the moment it is needed." Evernose stepped forward. He said, "You say you do not know the spy's name, but you know something. You know a detail, a description, a meeting place, a method of communication, something. Men like Andreas are careful, but no system is perfect. There is always a crack. Tell us what you know and we will consider mercy." Darius looked at Evernose. He looked at the soldiers surrounding him. He looked at Tamir Boga's axe. And then he said, "There is one thing. When I received my orders, they came through a messenger. The messenger carried a seal, not Andreas's seal, someone else's, someone inside your walls. The seal bore a mark I did not recognize, a crescent crossed with 2 arrows. Evernose looked at Orhan Saheb. The color had drained from his face. He said, "Sultan, I have seen that mark. It is the personal insignia of one of our own captains." Orhan Saheb said, "Which one?" Evernose said the name. He said it quietly, as though speaking it aloud might make it more real than he was prepared for it to be. He said, "Zarkin." The name fell upon the gathered men like a stone dropped into a well. It sank and sank and sank, and the ripples it created spread outward in every direction, touching everything, changing everything. Zarkin, a captain who had served the Kayı for years, a man who had fought beside them in battles that should have earned his loyalty 10 times over, a man who had broken bread with them, prayed beside them, bled on the same fields, mourned the same dead. Zarkin, a traitor. Orhan Saheb did not speak. He stood perfectly still. His face was stone. His hands were at his sides. But inside him, something was happening that no one could see. A war more violent than any he had ever fought on a physical battlefield. It was the war between trust and betrayal, between the instinct to forgive and the necessity to punish, between the love he had for his people and the rage he felt toward those who turned that love into a weapon to be used against him. Fatima said, "Zarkin was among the men we left behind in Bursa to guard the palace. If he is working for Andreas, then the palace itself is compromised. Malhan Khatun, the children, Aladdin, Ganya and the newborn child, they are all in danger." The words hit Orhan Saheb like a cavalry charge. His stillness shattered. He turned to Evernose and said, "We ride now, no rest, no stops. We ride until the horses cannot carry us and then we run." Evernose said, "The horses are tired, Sultan. If we push them too hard, we will lose them before we reach Bursa." Orhan Saheb said, "Then we take their horses." He pointed at the prisoners' mounts tied near the wagons. Fresh horses, rested horses, horses that had been standing idle for days waiting for an ambush that had just failed spectacularly. Evernose nodded. He began issuing orders. The prisoners were bound more securely and left under the guard of 3 soldiers who would follow at a slower pace. The fresh horses were saddled. Orhan Saheb mounted a tall, dark stallion that stamped and snorted beneath him as though it could sense the urgency in his body. Esporcha mounted behind him again. Fatima took a gray mare. Evernose took a chestnut gelding. Tamir Boga took the largest horse in the string, a massive bay that looked like it had been bred for war rather than trade. And they rode. They rode like the wind rides, without restraint, without mercy, without thought for anything except the destination. The road blurred beneath them. The landscape streamed past like a painting being torn from its frame. The sun arced overhead and they did not notice. The wind struck their faces and they did not feel it. Their bodies moved with their horses in that ancient unconscious union between rider and mount that transforms 2 separate beings into a single instrument of speed and purpose. Orhan Saheb's mind raced faster than his horse. Zarkin. The name repeated itself in his thoughts like a drumbeat, steady, relentless, maddening. How long had it been going on? How much had been compromised? What secrets had been sold? What plans had been betrayed? What lives had been lost because information that should have remained sealed within the walls of the Kayı Council had found its way into the hands of Andreas and through Andreas to the Shahzada, and through the Shahzada to every enemy that circled their borders like wolves circling a wounded deer. He thought of every battle that had gone wrong, every ambush they had failed to anticipate, every supply convoy that had been intercepted, every secret mission that had been met with resistance in places where there should have been none. How many of those failures had been the result of Zarkin's treachery? How many of those defeats had been purchased with stolen intelligence? How many of those deaths had been authored not by the enemy's brilliance, but by the betrayal of a man who wore their uniform and prayed in their mosque and looked them in the eye and lied with every breath he took? The anger built inside him like water behind a dam, rising, swelling, pressing against the walls of his self-control with increasing force. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drive his sword into the earth and roar until the mountains trembled. He wanted to find Zarkin and look him in the face and ask the only question that mattered. Why did you do this? What did they offer you that was worth more than your honor? What price did they put upon your soul, and was it enough? Was it enough to buy your silence in the grave that awaits you? Was it enough to purchase the forgiveness of Allah, who sees every secret and hears every whisper and records every betrayal in a ledger that cannot be burned or buried or destroyed? But he did not scream, he did not roar, he rode, because that was what was needed. That was what his people needed, not his rage, his presence, not his fury, his leadership, not his vengeance, his justice. And justice, he reminded himself, is not the same as vengeance. Justice is measured, justice is deliberate. Justice is the sword that cuts only what must be cut and spares what must be spared. Vengeance is the fire that burns everything, guilty and innocent alike, until nothing remains but ash and regret. He would not be a man of ash and regret, he would be a man of justice. They rode through the afternoon. The sun reached its zenith and began its long descent toward the western mountains. The shadows lengthened, the air cooled. The horses, pushed to their limits, began to slow, their sides heaving, their mouths foaming, their legs trembling with exhaustion. Orhan Sahib eased the pace but did not stop. He could not stop, not with the knowledge that burned inside him like a coal pressed against his heart. As the sun touched the mountains, as the sky turned from blue to gold to crimson to the deep luminous purple that precedes true darkness, they saw it. Bursa, rising from the plains like a promise that had been made at the beginning of time and kept through every generation since. Its walls glowed in the last light. Its minarets reached toward heaven like fingers pointing the way to salvation. Its gates stood open, welcoming, unaware of the serpent that coiled within its streets and waited in its shadows. Orhan Sahib pulled his horse to a halt on the ridge overlooking the city. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, his body aching, his mind sharp. He looked at Bursa and he said, "Somewhere in that city a man sits who has sold us to our enemies. He eats our bread, he sleeps beneath our roof, he prays in our mosque, and with every prayer he betrays the God he claims to serve. Tonight we will find him, tonight we will bring him before the council, tonight he will answer for what he has done. And the answer he gives will determine whether he lives or dies." Everno said, "And if he runs?" Orhan Sahib said, "He will not run. Men like Zarkin do not run because they do not believe they can be caught. Their arrogance is their armor, and their armor is made of glass." Fatima said, "And Andrea's, what of him?" Orhan Sahib said, "Andrea's is the hand, Zarkin is the finger. We will cut the finger first, and then we will follow the blood back to the hand." Esporcha finally spoke. Her voice was raw, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion and the faint, flickering ember of defiance that had kept her alive through everything she had endured. She said, "Orhan, promise me something." He turned to look at her. She said, "Promise me that when you find the men who destroyed my father, when you bring them to justice, when you end this war that has taken everything from everyone, promise me that you will not become what they are. Promise me that you will remain the man I married. The man who fights with honor, the man who prays before he strikes, the man who weeps for his enemies even as he defeats them. Promise me that." He looked at her for a long time. The last light of the day painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, and she was beautiful, not with the beauty of youth or vanity, but with the beauty of a woman who has walked through the fire and emerged not unburned but unbroken. He said, "I promise." And then he turned his horse toward the city and rode down the ridge, and behind him his people followed, and behind them the darkness gathered. And within that darkness the enemies of justice sharpened their blades and whispered their plans and believed, as all enemies of justice believe, that they would prevail. But the night has a way of revealing what the day conceals, and the truth has a way of rising, no matter how deep it is buried, no matter how heavy the stones that are placed upon its grave, no matter how loud the lies that are shouted to drown its voice. The truth rises. It always rises. And when it does, Nazreen, it does not come gently, it does not come politely, it comes like a flood, it comes like a fire, it comes like the sword of Allah himself, bright and terrible and absolutely, mercilessly, beautifully just. And the war continues. The swords remain unsheathed. The prayers remain unfinished. The traitor sits in his quarters in Bursa, unaware that the man he betrayed is riding toward him with the speed of divine retribution and the patience of eternal justice. And somewhere in a Kanka far behind them, a broken emperor sits in a chair and stares at a wall. And somewhere in a palace, a newborn child cries for the first time. And somewhere on a ridge between two worlds, the ghost of Orhan Sahib plays his kappas, and the music drifts across the land like a prayer that will never end, a song that will never be silenced, a melody that carries within it the memory of everything that has been lost and the promise of everything that is yet to be found. Assalamu alaikum Nazreen. The gates of Bursa swallowed them the way the mouth of a great beast swallows the last light of evening completely irrevocably, and with the quiet certainty that nothing which enters will leave unchanged. Orhan Sahib rode through those gates with his back straight and his eyes forward and his jaw set like a man who has already decided what must be done and is now simply waiting for the world to arrange itself around his decision. The streets were nearly empty. The hour was late. The merchants had folded their stalls. The children had been called inside. The dogs that roamed the alleys during the day had retreated to their corners and curled into themselves like questions that had been asked but never answered. Only the lanterns remained, hanging from their posts like small, stubborn suns refusing to acknowledge that the darkness had won. The hoofbeats echoed against the stone streets. Each beat was a word in a language that the city understood instinctively, the language of urgency, of authority, of a ruler returning not in triumph but in necessity, not with spoils but with knowledge, and knowledge, when it concerns betrayal, is the heaviest burden a man can carry. Evernos rode close behind. His hand had not left his sword since they entered the city walls. He scanned every rooftop, every window, every doorway, every shadow that moved or might move or might one day consider moving. He was not looking for enemies. He was looking for the absence of normalcy, the small, almost invisible disturbances in the fabric of everyday life that announced the presence of conspiracy, the way ripples on a still pond announced the presence of something beneath the surface. Fatima had pulled her scarf tighter around her face. Not for modesty now, but for anonymity. She did not want to be recognized. She did not want whispers spreading through the city before they had a chance to act. She knew how quickly information traveled in a place like Bursa, through servants, through guards, through the wives of merchants who spoke to the wives of soldiers, who spoke to the wives of commanders, who spoke to the commanders themselves. A single pair of eyes recognizing Fatima Khatun riding through the streets at this hour with armed soldiers would be enough to alert everyone who needed alerting, including those who must not be alerted. Esporcha had dismounted at the gate and now walked beside the horse, her hand on its flank, her steps slow and deliberate, the steps of a woman who was moving through a dream she had not chosen to enter and could not find a way to leave. She said nothing. She had said almost nothing since they left the Konka. Her silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a wound that has not yet begun to bleed, a wound so deep that the body has not yet registered the damage, a wound that will announce itself later, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a prayer, in the middle of an ordinary moment, with a sudden, overwhelming, devastating flood of pain that will bring her to her knees. But that was later. Now she walked, and she was grateful for the walking because walking required just enough concentration to keep the flood at bay. They reached the palace compound. The outer guards recognized Orhan Sahib and snapped to attention, their spears vertical, their faces taut with surprise and respect. One of them stepped forward and said, "Sultan, we were not expecting your return tonight. Shall I alert the household?" Orhan Sahib said, "No, tell no one. Open the side gate. We enter through the western courtyard and send for Damir Khan. Tell him to come alone. Tell him to come armed. Tell him to tell no one where he is going." The guard hesitated for the space of a single heartbeat, long enough for his mind to register the weight of what he had just been told, and then he bowed and disappeared into the darkness. They entered through the western courtyard, a smaller, more private enclosure used for receiving sensitive guests and conducting conversations that the walls of the main hall were not meant to hear. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls. The fountain in the center still flowed, its water catching the firelight and throwing fractured reflections across the stone floor like shattered mirrors, showing glimpses of a world that existed only in fragments. Orhan Sahib dismounted. He handed his horse to Ayaz and said, "Water them, feed them, then position yourself at the courtyard entrance. No one enters without my permission. No one." Ayaz nodded and led the horses away. Orhan Sahib turned to Evernos and said, "Bring Shamal and Tamir Boga to me when they arrive. I want them here before we move." Evernos said, "They are perhaps an hour behind us. They were securing the prisoners." Orhan Sahib said, "Then we use that hour. Fatima, take Esporcha to her quarters. See that she has water and food and a fire. Stay with her." Fatima took Esporcha's hand and began to lead her away, but Esporcha stopped. She turned and looked at Orhan Sahib and said, "When you find Zarkin, I want to be there." Orhan Sahib looked at her. He said no. She said, "He is part of the machine that destroyed my father. He fed information to Andreas. Andreas used that information to isolate my father, to strip him of his allies, to trap him in that Konka, to break his mind. Zarkin's hands may not have touched my father, but his words did. His betrayal did, and I want to look him in the eyes when he answers for it. Orhan Sahib studied her face. He saw the steel in it. He saw the fire beneath the exhaustion, beneath the grief, beneath the layers of heartbreak that had accumulated upon her soul like sediment at the bottom of a river. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to protect her from one more act of violence, one more scene of confrontation, one more encounter with the bottomless cruelty of which human beings are capable. But he also understood something that many men in his position fail to understand, that protection, when taken too far, becomes another form of imprisonment, and that Asportia had spent enough time behind walls that were not of her choosing. He said, "You will be there, but you will not speak. Not until I give you permission. This must be handled with precision, not passion." She nodded. Fatima led her away, and Orhan Sahib was left standing in the courtyard with Evernoz, the torchlight dancing on their faces, the sound of the fountain filling the silence between them with its ceaseless, indifferent music. Evernoz said, "How do you want to do this?" Orhan Sahib walked to the fountain and stood beside it and looked down into the water. He saw his own reflection, distorted, fragmented, unrecognizable. He said, "Zarkin is cunning. He has survived this long not because he is invisible but because he is careful. He does not leave evidence. He does not make mistakes. He communicates through intermediaries and dead drops and coded messages that dissolve into meaninglessness the moment they are read. If we confront him directly, he will deny everything. He will look us in the eye and swear upon everything sacred that he is innocent, and he will do it with such conviction that even I might doubt what I know." Evernoz said, "Then we need proof, something he cannot deny, something that removes the ground from beneath his feet." Orhan Sahib said, "We have the seal. The crescent crossed with 2 arrows. Darius described it. If Zarkin carries that seal, if we can find it among his possessions, then his denial becomes meaningless. A man can explain away a conversation. A man can explain away a meeting. A man can even explain away a coincidence. But a man cannot explain away his own personal insignia, stamped upon orders sent to enemy mercenaries who were positioned to assassinate his sultan." Evernoz said, "If we search his quarters, he will know he is suspected. If he knows he is suspected, he will run. Or worse, he will send a warning to Andreas. And if Andreas learns that we know about Zarkin, he will dismantle his entire network and rebuild it from scratch, and we will have gained nothing except the satisfaction of catching one man while the machine that produced him continues to operate." Orhan Sahib said, "Which is why we will not search his quarters. We will let him reveal himself." Evernoz looked at him. He said, "How?" Orhan Sahib said, "By giving him something he cannot resist reporting to Andreas. A piece of information so valuable, so urgent, so irresistible that he will have no choice but to contact his handler immediately. And when he does, when he reaches for whatever method he uses to communicate with Andreas, we will be watching. We will see the method. We will see the route. We will follow the thread all the way back to the spider at the center of the web." Evernoz was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What kind of information would be that irresistible?" Orhan Sahib said, "The kind that changes everything. The kind that Andreas would pay any price to receive. The kind that, if Zarkin fails to deliver, would cost him his position, his payment, perhaps his life. Andreas does not tolerate failure in his agents. He rewards with gold and punishes with death. Zarkin knows this, and that fear, that constant, knowing fear of failing his dark master, is the lever we will use to move him." He turned from the fountain and faced Evernoz and said, "Tomorrow morning I will call a council. Full council, every commander, every captain, every advisor, and in that council I will announce that we have captured one of Andreas's agents, a man named Darius, and I will announce that Darius has revealed the existence of a spy within our ranks, but I will not name the spy. I will say only that we are close to identifying him, that we have evidence. That it is only a matter of hours before the spy is exposed." Evernoz understood immediately. He said, "And Zarkin will be sitting in that council, hearing every word, knowing that the walls are closing in around him. And when the council ends, he will have 2 choices. Stay and be caught, or run to Andreas and report what he has heard, hoping that Andreas can extract him before we close the trap." Orhan Sahib said, "Either way, he reveals himself. If he runs, we follow him. If he sends a message, we intercept it. If he does nothing, then the pressure builds, and pressure is the enemy of composure. A man under pressure makes mistakes, and Zarkin, for all his cunning, is still a man." Evernoz said, "And if he does something we do not anticipate, if he has a contingency, if Andreas has given him instructions for exactly this scenario?" Orhan Sahib said, "Then we adapt. We have been adapting since the day we were born. It is what we do. It is what makes us different from men like Andreas who build rigid systems and expect the world to conform to them. We do not build rigid systems, we build ourselves, and a man who has built himself cannot be broken by the collapse of a system because he is not a system. He is a soul, and souls do not collapse, they endure." Evernoz placed his fist over his heart and bowed his head and said, "As you command, Sultan." They waited. The hour passed slowly, each minute stretching itself like a sleeping animal reluctant to move. The torches burned lower. The fountain sang its monotonous song. The stars above the courtyard turned in their ancient indifferent circles, unchanged by the dramas unfolding beneath them, unchanged by the betrayals and the battles and the births and the deaths that comprised the sum total of human existence on this small, fragile, beautiful, terrible sphere of rock and water spinning through the void. And then Damir Khan arrived. He came through the western gate alone, as instructed, armed, as instructed, and confused, as expected. He was a tall man, lean and angular, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same stone that formed the mountains beyond the city walls. He had served the Kayı since before Orhan Sahib's father's time. He was old enough to remember the wars that preceded the current wars, the treaties that preceded the current treaties, the betrayals that preceded the current betrayals. He had buried more friends than most men ever make, and he had survived not through strength alone but through the application of a ruthless, unsentimental intelligence that could process a situation, identify its variables, calculate its outcomes, and choose the optimal course of action in less time than it took most men to draw their swords. He entered the courtyard and saw Orhan Sahib and Evernose standing beside the fountain, and he stopped and bowed and said, "Sultan, I came as quickly as I could. What has happened?" Orhan Sahib said, "Sit down, Damir Khan. What I am about to tell you will require steadiness." Damir Khan sat on the stone bench beside the fountain. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at Orhan Sahib with the patience of a man who has received bad news so many times in his life that he has developed a specific posture for it. Orhan Sahib told him everything. He told him about the Kanka, about Shahanshah, about the Shahzada's arrival, about the escape, about the ambush on the road, about Darius, about the seal, about Zarkin. When he finished, the courtyard was silent except for the fountain. Damir Khan sat perfectly still. His face betrayed nothing. His hands remained folded. His breathing did not change. But behind his eyes something moved, something old and dangerous and utterly merciless, the instinct of a veteran who has survived by learning to identify threats and eliminate them with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. He said, "Zarkin, I always thought there was something wrong with his reports. They were too clean, too detailed, too perfectly aligned with what we already believed. A man who agrees with everything is a man who is hiding something. Agreement is the easiest disguise a traitor can wear because no one suspects the man who never disagrees." Orhan Sahib said, "I need you to watch him, starting now, tonight. I want to know where he goes, who he speaks to, what he eats, how he sleeps, which direction he faces when he prays, and whether his lips move during the prayer or simply go through the motions. I want to know everything about him without him knowing that anything has changed." Damir Khan said, "You want a shadow?" Orhan Sahib said, "I want something darker than a shadow. A shadow can be seen in the right light. I want something that cannot be seen at all." Damir Khan stood. He placed his fist over his heart. He said, "By dawn I will have 2 of my most trusted men on him, men who could follow a hawk through a storm and the hawk would not notice. By the time your council convenes tomorrow, we will know his routines, his contacts, his habits, and the location of every rat hole he might try to escape through." He turned to leave, then he stopped and said, without turning back, "Sultan, when this is over, when Zarkin has been exposed and judged and dealt with, I ask one favor." Orhan Sahib said, "Name it." Damir Khan said, "Let me be the one who delivers the sentence. Whatever sentence you impose, let it come from my hand, because Zarkin served under me for 3 years. He was my lieutenant before he was transferred to the palace guard. I trained him, I trusted him, I vouched for him when others had doubts. His treachery is not just a betrayal of you, Sultan. It is a betrayal of me, of my judgment, of my word, and I will not let that debt go unpaid." Orhan Sahib said, "You will have your chance, Damir Khan, but first we must be certain. First we must have proof that even he cannot deny. Go." Damir Khan disappeared into the night. The courtyard was quiet again. Evernose said, "He is a good man, Damir Khan." Orhan Sahib said, "He is the best of us, which is why Zarkin's betrayal cuts him deeper than it cuts any of us. When a man you train turns against you, it is not just a tactical failure. It is a personal one. It makes you question everything you taught him, everything you saw in him, everything you believed about your own ability to judge character. And that kind of questioning, if it goes too deep, can cripple a man far more effectively than any wound." They stood in silence for a time. Then Shamal and Tamir Boga arrived with the remaining soldiers. The prisoners had been secured at a way station 2 hours outside the city, guarded by reliable men who asked no questions and expected no answers. Shamal reported this efficiently and then asked, "What happens now, Sultan?" Orhan Sahib said, "Now we rest, for a few hours, because tomorrow will be the beginning of something that none of us can afford to face with tired minds and slow reflexes. Tomorrow we begin dismantling the network that has been feeding our enemies from within our own walls. And dismantling a network is not like fighting a battle. In a battle, the enemy stands before you and you know his face. In this, the enemy sits beside you and smiles and passes you the bread and asks about your children and waits for you to turn your back. Tamir Boga said, I do not like this kind of fighting. Give me a field and an enemy I can see and a weapon I can swing. This business of spies and seals and hidden messages makes my blood itch. Orhan Sahib almost smiled. He said, your blood will have its chance to stop itching soon enough, Tamir Boga. Before this is over, there will be fields, there will be enemies you can see, and there will be more swinging than even your arms can handle. Tamir Boga grunted in satisfaction and went to find his quarters. The night deepened. The palace settled into the uneasy quiet of a place that does not know it is harboring a traitor within its walls, the way a body does not know it is harboring a disease until the symptoms become impossible to ignore. Servants moved through the corridors carrying trays and linens and whispered conversations that evaporated the moment a door closed behind them. Guards stood at their posts and stared into the darkness and thought about their families and their pay and their chances of surviving whatever was coming next. Orhan Sahib did not go to his quarters immediately. He went first to the chamber where Ganya Khatun lay with her newborn child. He entered quietly, pushing the door open with the gentleness of a man who understands that the space between a mother and her new child is sacred ground, not to be trampled, not to be disturbed, only to be entered with reverence and only when necessary. Ganya was asleep. The child lay beside her, swaddled in white cloth, its tiny face visible above the wrapping, its eyes closed, its mouth slightly open, its breathing so faint that Orhan Sahib had to look twice to confirm that it was happening at all. A small, perfect, impossibly fragile life. A life that had entered the world in the midst of chaos and treachery and war, as all lives do, as every life has since the first child was born into the first storm. Laden was sitting beside the bed on a low stool, his elbows on his knees, his chin resting on his clasped hands, his eyes fixed upon his child with the unwavering, slightly bewildered intensity of a new father who cannot quite believe that this has happened, that this is real, that this impossibly small creature is the product of his love and the evidence of his mortality and the carrier of his legacy, and the answer to every prayer he has uttered since the day he learned that Ganya was with child. He looked up when Orhan Sahib entered. His eyes were red from lack of sleep and excess of emotion. He stood and whispered, Sultan, brother, come see. Orhan Sahib walked to the bedside and looked down at the child. He looked at its face, at its closed eyes, at its tiny, curled fingers, at the delicate rise and fall of its chest, and something inside him shifted. Something that had been clenched tight since the conquest, since the escape, since the ambush, since the discovery of Zarkin's betrayal, something that had been wound so tight that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without effort, that something loosened. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind him that the world was not only darkness and treachery and war, the world was also this child, this breath, this miracle. He said, what have you named the child? Aladdin smiled, that shy, uncertain, radiant smile of a man who has just been handed the greatest responsibility of his life and is terrified and overjoyed in equal measure. He said, we have not yet decided. Ganya wants to name him after her father. I want to name him after ours. We are still discussing. Orhan Sahib said, then discuss well. A name is not a label. It is a destiny. Choose a name that the child can grow into, not one that the child must live beneath. Aladdin nodded, then he looked at his brother more carefully and said, you look tired, brother, more tired than I have ever seen you. What happened at the Conca? Did you find a Sporcha? Orhan Sahib said, I found her. She is safe. She is here, but her father could not be saved. His mind is broken beyond repair. The Shahzada has claimed him as a puppet and a prop. As Sporcha grieves, I grieve with her, but we are alive. And life, as this child proves, continues whether we are ready for it or not. He paused, then he said, there is more, Aladdin, but not tonight. Tonight you are a father. Tonight your world is this room and this woman and this child. Tomorrow the world outside will demand your attention, but tonight it can wait. Aladdin looked at him with eyes that understood more than the words conveyed. He said, whatever it is, brother, I am with you, as I have always been, as I will always be. Orhan Sahib placed his hand upon Aladdin's shoulder and squeezed once firmly, and then turned and left the room. He walked through the corridors of the palace toward his own quarters. The corridors were long and dimly lit, and filled with the particular silence of a building that is full of sleeping people, a silence that is not empty but densely populated with dreams and fears and the subconscious murmuring of minds that cannot rest even when their bodies demand it. He passed the door to the children's quarters. He stopped. He placed his hand upon the door but did not open it. Behind this door, Qasim and Sulayman and Gulsum slept the troubled sleep of children who had confessed to something they were not sure was wrong but had been told was unforgivable. He thought of Qasim. He thought of those eyes. He thought of the conversation that awaited them, the conversation in which he would have to be a sultan first and a father second, in which he would have to explain that the right thing done in the wrong way is still the wrong thing, that intentions do not excuse consequences, that love without discipline is chaos and discipline without love is tyranny, and the space between those two extremes is the narrowest, most treacherous, most important ground that any human being ever has to walk. He lowered his hand and walked on. That conversation could wait until morning. Everything could wait until morning. Everything except the work of Daimir Khan, who was, at this very moment, deploying his invisible watchers around Zarkin like a net being drawn tight around a fish that did not yet know it was caught. He reached his quarters. He pushed open the door and found Asportia sitting on the edge of the bed, still dressed, still awake, still wrapped in that terrible silence that had become her companion since the Conca. A single lamp burned on the table beside her. Its light was warm but inadequate, like a word of comfort offered in the face of a grief that is beyond the reach of words. She looked up when he entered. She did not smile. She did not rise. She said, "Did you see the child?" He said, "I did." She said, "Is it well?" He said, "It is perfect." She nodded. She looked at her hands. She said, "I thought I could save him, Orhan. I truly believed that if I could just reach him, if I could just touch his hand and say his name and remind him that his daughter still existed, that there was still something in this world worth returning to, I believed he would stand up. I believed he would walk with me. I believed that love was stronger than whatever they had done to him." She paused. Her voice cracked but did not break. She said, "I was wrong. Love is not enough. Love is not enough when they have emptied a man of everything that made him a man. Love cannot fill a vessel that has been shattered. It can only run through the cracks and puddle on the floor and be stepped in by everyone who passes through the room without noticing." Orhan Sahib sat beside her. He did not touch her. He did not put his arm around her. He simply sat. And he let the silence do what silence does best when two people who love each other are in pain. He let it hold them. He let it surround them like water surrounding two stones at the bottom of a river, not pulling them apart, not pushing them together, just being present, constant, undemanding. After a long time, Asportia said, "What will happen now?" He said, "Now we fight, not the Shahzada, not yet. First we fight the enemy within, the spy, the traitor, the man who has been selling our secrets to the people who destroyed your father. We find him, we expose him, we follow his trail back to Andrea's. And when we have mapped the full extent of their network, when we know every node and every connection and every hidden pathway through which their poison flows, then we destroy it. All of it, completely, permanently. So that no one ever again can do to another family what they did to yours." She looked at him. She said, "And my father?" He said, "Your father is alive. And as long as he is alive, there is hope, not much, not enough, but some. And I have learned, Asportia, through years of fighting battles that should not have been won and surviving nights that should not have been survived, that some is enough. Some is always enough, because hope does not need to be large to be powerful. A single coal can burn down a forest. A single drop can wear through stone. A single breath can sustain a man through an entire night of darkness. And we have more than a single breath. We have each other, and that, I promise you, is more than enough." She leaned against him then. She rested her head upon his shoulder and closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time since the Conca, to stop fighting, to stop resisting, to stop holding together the broken pieces of herself through sheer force of will. She let go, and he held her, and the lamp burned low, and the night, for the first time in what felt like weeks, was quiet. But the quiet was temporary. The quiet is always temporary. Because beneath the silence, beneath the sleeping palace, beneath the streets of Bursa, beneath the stars that turned overhead with their ancient mechanical indifference, the machinery of war and treachery and ambition continued to grind. Zarkin slept in his quarters and dreamed whatever dreams traitors dream. Andrea sat in his dark chamber and moved pieces on a board that only he could see. The Shahzada raged in his Conca, screaming at his soldiers, demanding to know how a single man had walked into his compound and walked out with his most valuable prisoner. And somewhere in a corridor of that same Conca, Rahiba Sophia moved through the shadows with a candle in her hand, checking doors, checking locks, whispering prayers in a language that only she and her God understood. And in Bursa, in a room above the western gate, Daimir Khan stood at a window and looked out over the sleeping city and thought about the man he had trained, the man he had trusted, the man whose hand he had shaken and whose shoulder he had gripped and whose name he had spoken with pride. Zarkin. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He spat into the darkness and turned from the window and went to give his final instructions to the two men who would become Zarkin's shadows, who would follow him so closely that they would know his heartbeat, who would watch him so carefully that they would see the guilt in his eyes before he even felt it in his heart. And the night continued, and the war continued, and the great and terrible wheel of history continued to turn, grinding beneath it the bones of the guilty and the innocent alike, crushing empires and raising them again, burying secrets and unearthing them, ending lives and beginning them, moving always forward, always forward, always forward into a future that no one can see but everyone must face. And Orhan Sahib sat on the edge of his bed with his wife's head upon his shoulder, and his sword leaning against the wall within arm's reach and his eyes open, staring at the darkness, seeing not the darkness but the outline of everything that lay within it, the shape of the coming confrontation, the architecture of the trap he would set, the faces of the men who would stand beside him and the face of the man who would stand against him, and behind all of those faces, the face of justice itself. Stern and beautiful and patient and absolute, waiting for its moment to speak. And it would speak soon, very soon. But not yet. Not yet, Nazarene, not quite yet. The dawn was coming, and with the dawn would come the council, and with the council would come the announcement, and with the announcement would come the fear, and with the fear would come the mistake, and with the mistake would come the truth. And the truth, as it always does, would change everything. The night had not yet released its grip upon the earth when Orhan Sahib crossed the threshold of the Kanka, his boots pressing against cold stone, his breath measured, his eyes cutting through the dim corridors like the edge of a blade seeking its mark. The air inside was thick with the scent of old incense and damp walls, and somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a woman's prayer drifted and then died. He moved forward, each step deliberate, each step carrying the weight of a man who had ridden through fire and deception to reach this moment. And then he saw her, Rahiba Sophia, standing alone near the far wall, her hands folded before her, her face pale beneath the veil of her station, and in her eyes that unmistakable flicker of someone who has been waiting not in peace but in dread. Orhan Sahib raised his sword. The steel caught the faint glow of a single candle and threw a line of light across the stone ceiling, and he pointed the blade directly at her and spoke with a voice that left no room for hesitation. "Where is Sporcha? Tell me now." His words did not echo. They struck. They landed upon the walls and upon the woman before him and upon the silence itself like stones dropped into still water. Rahiba Sophia did not flinch. She looked at the sword and then she looked at the man behind it and she said, "Sultan Orhan, I can help you." Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, as though she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times before it arrived. Orhan Sahib narrowed his eyes and asked, "Who are you?" She answered without pause, "I am the head priestess of this Kanka. I am its guardian, its keeper, but we must leave this place now. Clems and his men could arrive at any moment. They patrol these halls, they answer to no mercy." Orhan Sahib lowered the blade only slightly. He repeated the name as though tasting something bitter. "Clems, who is Clems?" And before the words had fully left his mouth, before the silence could even form around the question, a voice came from behind him, a voice soaked in arrogance and venom, rolling forward through the darkness of the corridor like a serpent uncoiling. "I am Clems, you must be Orhan." Orhan Sahib turned, and there he stood. Clems, a broad man with dead eyes and a jaw like carved stone, flanked by 2 soldiers whose swords were already drawn. Behind them the corridor stretched into blackness, and behind that blackness nothing good waited. Clems looked at Orhan Sahib the way a butcher looks at an animal that has wandered too far from the herd. He smiled, and then he gave the order, "Kill him." The 2 soldiers lunged forward. Their boots scraped the stone. Their blades came arcing through the candlelight, one from the left and one from the right, time to close upon Orhan Sahib like the jaws of a trap. But Orhan Sahib did not retreat. He did not even blink. In the space of a single breath, a breath shorter than the flutter of an eyelid, he twisted his body, brought his sword up in a sweeping diagonal arc, and caught the first soldier's blade mid-swing. The clash of steel rang through the corridor like a struck bell. He deflected the blow outward, reversed his grip, and drove the pommel of his sword into the soldier's throat. The man staggered. Orhan Sahib did not give him time to recover. He spun low and fast and brought the edge of his blade across the man's midsection with a force that ended all argument. The soldier dropped. The second man hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything. Orhan Sahib stepped into the gap between them, caught the soldier's wrist with his free hand, twisted it until the bone cracked, and then drove his sword through the man's chest. The steel went in clean and came out red. Both bodies hit the floor before the echo of Clems's order had finished bouncing off the walls. Clems stared. The smile was gone. In its place was something else entirely, something that men like Clems rarely allowed themselves to feel but could never fully hide. Fear, raw, primal, and absolute. But he was a soldier, and soldiers do not run, not when their pride is watching. He drew his own blade. It was heavier than those of his men, a broadsword meant for crushing rather than cutting, and he held it before him with both hands and said nothing. Orhan Sahib advanced. Their blades met. The sound was different this time, deeper, harder, the sound of 2 wills colliding rather than 2 weapons. Clems swung wide. Orhan Sahib ducked beneath the arc and countered with a thrust that Clems barely deflected. They exchanged blows in that narrow corridor, steel ringing against steel, shadows dancing on the walls like the ghosts of all the men who had died in places exactly like this one, unnamed, unremembered, their blood soaked into the stones beneath the feet of the living. Clems was strong. Orhan Sahib was faster. Clems fought with the desperation of a man defending his territory. Orhan Sahib fought with the precision of a man who had crossed mountains and deserts and enemy lines to stand exactly where he was standing. After a dozen exchanges, after parrying a blow that would have split a lesser man's skull, Orhan Sahib found the opening. Clems overextended on a downward chop. Orhan Sahib sidestepped, let the blade crash into the stone floor, and brought his own sword across in a single, clean, horizontal stroke. The edge caught Clems at the neck, and Clems fell. He fell like all tyrants fall, suddenly, completely, and with a look of disbelief frozen upon his face, as though the world had betrayed him by allowing such a thing to happen. Silence returned. Orhan Sahib stood over the bodies. His breathing was steady. His hand did not tremble. He wiped the blade against his cloak and then turned back toward Rahiba Sophia, who had pressed herself against the wall during the fight, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide. He walked to her and asked in that same measured voice, "Who is this Kafir? Tell me everything." Sophia lowered her hands and spoke. He was one of Andreas's men. He had been assigned to guard the Shahanshah. To keep him imprisoned here under the guise of protection. We must go now, Sultan. This way, Shahzadi Esporcha is waiting. And so Rahiba Sophia turned and led Orhan Sahib through the winding corridors of the Khanqa, through passages lit by dying candles and passages lit by nothing at all, through doorways that groaned on rusted hinges and through silences that felt heavier than chains. They moved quickly but carefully, their footsteps muffled, their shadows blending with the darkness. And as they moved, Orhan Sahib kept his sword drawn and his senses sharp, because he knew that in a place like this, death did not announce itself. It simply arrived. They reached a door at the far end of a corridor. Sophia stopped. She placed her hand upon the wood and looked at Orhan Sahib and said, "She is inside, with her father. He has not spoken in days." Orhan Sahib nodded and pushed the door open. Inside the room, lit by a single lamp whose flame trembled as though it too was afraid, Shahzadi Esporcha sat beside her father. Shahanshah was seated in a chair near the wall, but he was not truly seated. He was collapsed. His body occupied the chair the way rubble occupies a ruin. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. His hands lay in his lap like objects that no longer belonged to him. He was breathing, but breathing was all he was doing. Esporcha was kneeling beside him. Her hands gripped his arm. Her face was streaked with tears that had dried and been replaced by new ones so many times that her skin looked raw. She was speaking to him in a voice that was half whisper and half plea. "Come, Baba, please, we must go. Stand up, walk with me, we will leave this place. I will take you away from here. Come, Baba, please." But Shahanshah said nothing. He stared at the wall as though the wall held the answer to a question he had stopped asking long ago. His lips did not move, his fingers did not twitch. Whatever they had done to him in this place, whatever poison they had fed his mind, whatever cruelty they had wrapped in the language of diplomacy and power, it had broken something inside him that no healer could reach. Esporcha looked up at the sound of the door and saw Orhan Sahib standing in the doorway. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Esporcha rose, her grief turned to fire. She grabbed a blade from beside her father's chair and hurled herself at the doorway, at this intruder, at this shadow that had dared to enter the last refuge she had in the world. She swung the blade wildly, desperately, the way a cornered animal strikes, not with skill but with the full fury of survival. Orhan Sahib caught her arm. He gripped her wrist firmly but not cruelly and pulled her close and held her until the blade fell from her fingers and clattered against the floor. She struggled. She pushed against his chest. And then she recognized him. And when she did, the fight went out of her like air escaping a punctured bellows. She whispered his name, Orhan. He held her a moment longer and then released her and looked into her eyes and asked, "Are you hurt? Are you well?" She shook her head, not to say no, to say that the question itself was meaningless in the face of what she had endured. She said, "What are you doing here, Orhan? How did you find this place?" He said, "I am the one who should ask that question, but not now. We will speak of this later. Right now we must leave." Esporcha's eyes filled again. She turned toward her father. "I cannot leave him. I will not. They will kill him." Orhan Sahib looked at Shahanshah. He walked toward him and knelt and looked into those empty eyes and called his name. "Shahanshah, can you hear me? We are leaving. You must stand." But Shahanshah did not respond. He sat there like a man whose soul had already departed while his body waited for permission to follow. Esporcha knelt beside him again and gripped his hands and said through her tears, "Please, Baba, stand up. We will walk out of here. I will not leave you, not like this. Not ever. Please stand, walk, come with me." And then Shahanshah spoke. His voice was a ruin, a cracked, hollow thing that barely qualified as sound. He did not look at Esporcha. He looked at Orhan Sahib, and he said, "Orhan, your grandsons will take the throne that my grandson stole from me." Esporcha shook her head violently. "No, no, Baba, you cannot give up this easily. Not now, not after everything. Stand up, come walk with me. Come, Baba, come." Orhan Sahib looked at Esporcha and said gently but firmly, "Esporcha, we must go, now." And she looked at her father one last time, and in that look was every prayer she had ever uttered, every night she had spent awake wondering if the morning would bring rescue or ruin, every tear she had shed in silence because she was a Shahzadi and Shahzadis do not weep where others can see. She kissed his forehead. She whispered something that no one else heard, and then she stood. Meanwhile, outside the Konka, the night was not idle. Evernos stood in the shadows of a ridge overlooking the compound, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning every movement below. Beside him stood Fatima, her jaw set, her hand gripping the handle of a dagger at her belt. Behind them, Tamir Boga, Shamal, Mustafa Ayaz, and a company of their finest soldiers waited in tense silence, crouched among the rocks and brush like wolves watching a camp of unsuspecting travelers. Fatima spoke first. It has been too long. We do not know if my brother found a sporcha inside. We do not know if he is alive or trapped or fighting. Should we not go and see? Shamal nodded. Fatima Khatan speaks rightly. Too much time has passed. We cannot simply sit here and wait for fate to decide. Tamir Boga added, perhaps our sultan is in danger. We should move now. Every moment we delay is a moment stolen from him. Evernos considered this. His face betrayed nothing. He was a man who had learned long ago that the worst decisions are made in the grip of urgency and the best decisions are made in the grip of patience. But patience, he knew, had its limits. He opened his mouth to give the order. And then Mustafa appeared. He came running from the eastern slope, breathless, his face white with alarm. He raised his hand and said, "Stop, wait." Tamir Boga turned and asked, "What is it, Mustafa? What has happened?" Mustafa bent over, caught his breath, and then straightened and delivered the news that changed everything. The Shahzada, he is coming this way. He has his full force with him. Hundreds of soldiers, infantry, cavalry, they are moving toward the Konka now. The words fell upon them like a volley of arrows. Evernos's jaw tightened. He looked toward the road and saw nothing yet, but he trusted Mustafa's eyes more than his own, for Mustafa had been their scout since the first campaigns, and Mustafa did not exaggerate. Evernos said, "The Shahzada comes to meet his grandfather. He comes to claim what he believes is already his." Shamal said, "Our sultan must leave the Konka immediately. He must come out with a sporcha Khatan before the Shahzada arrives. Otherwise, he will be trapped inside with no escape and no reinforcement." Fatima said, "Then we must warn him. We must get inside." Tamir Boga said, "Evernos, when the Shahzada's forces reach this place, we will have no chance. No opening, no possibility. We must act now." A soldier spoke up, "Our sultan ordered us to stay outside. He commanded us not to enter." Shamal turned to the soldier and said, "That order was given before we knew the Shahzada was coming with an army. The situation has changed. The ground beneath our feet has shifted. We cannot obey an order that was made for a world that no longer exists." Tamir Boga nodded. "He is right." Fatima said, "Then it is decided. We either attack or we enter the Konka. Whatever you command, Evernos Saheb, but we must do something. My brother is in there." Evernos looked at each of them in turn. He looked at Fatima, whose eyes burned with the fire of a sister who would walk into a furnace for her brother. He looked at Shamal, steady and loyal. He looked at Tamir Boga, fierce and impatient. He looked at Mustafa, who had run through the night to bring them this warning. And then he made his decision. But he held it. He held it because the moment demanded more than haste. It demanded faith. And while the night coiled tighter around the Konka like a serpent preparing to strike, while the armies of the Shahzada drew closer with every breath, while Orhan Sahib stood inside those walls with his wife and her broken father and a priestess who had risked her life for strangers, across the world, in another chamber, in another story being written simultaneously by the hand of the Almighty, life was asserting itself in the most unexpected way. In the palace of Bursa inside the Great Hall, Qasim and Sulayman and Gulsum stood before Malhan Khatan with their heads bowed and their hands clasped and their hearts hammering with the guilt of children who have done something they know cannot be undone. Nilofer stood beside Malhan. Ganya Khatan sat nearby, her hand resting upon her swollen belly, her breath slightly shallow. Nilofer spoke first. She looked at the children and said, "Come now, speak. We have been waiting for you. Tell us what you have done." The children remained silent. Their silence was not defiance. It was shame. It was the silence of young hearts that have acted on impulse and are now drowning in the consequences. Ganya leaned forward slightly and said with a gentle but curious voice, "What is so important? I am curious, children, tell us." Then Sulayman spoke. His voice trembled. He said, "We know that what we did cannot be forgiven, but we must tell you, we must confess." Malhan Khatan raised an eyebrow. She said, "What have you done that cannot be forgiven? Open your mouths, untie the locks on your tongues, speak." Qasim looked at the floor and said, "We helped Shahzadi Esporcha escape." The words struck the room like thunder. Nilofer's face went pale. She stepped forward and said, what are you saying, Qasim? How could you do such a thing? Malhan Khatun's expression hardened. She looked at Sulayman and said, Sulayman, Qasim and Gulsum are children. They do not understand the weight of what they have done. But you are old enough to think. You are old enough to know better. How could you allow this to happen? Nilofer placed her hand over her heart and whispered, O Sulayman, O my child, what have you done? And then in the midst of this storm of confession and accusation, Ganya Khatun gasped. She pressed both hands against her belly and her face contorted with sudden, sharp pain. Iraj, who had been standing near the door, rushed forward and cried, the child is coming. She turned and ran from the room, shouting for the midwife. Everything shifted in an instant. The interrogation of the children was abandoned like a campfire left burning in the wilderness. Malhan turned to the children and said with a voice like iron wrapped in silk, This is not over. We will speak of this later. Every word of this will be answered. And then she turned and followed Ganya out of the hall, and Nilofer followed, and the women of the household moved like a river changing course, flowing toward the chamber where a new life was demanding entry into the world. Outside the palace in the courtyard, Aladdin Sahib and Khalil arrived on horseback. They dismounted in the fading light. Aladdin Sahib turned to Khalil and spoke with a voice that was heavy with memory and loss. He said, Good, we are here. Listen, Khalil, Boran Sahib's treasure was nothing more than his sword and his kappas. He left behind a great legacy. He sang the battle songs that our fathers sang before us. He is gone from this world now, but we will carry those songs forward. We will sing them in his name, inshallah. Khalil bowed his head and said, Inshallah, my brother, inshallah. And then Iraj came running out of the palace doors, breathless, her veil slipping from her head, her eyes wide with urgency. She cried, my wazir, you must come inside. Ganya Khatun, you must go to her. Aladdin Sahib froze, his face changed. He asked, What has happened? Is she well? What is wrong with Ganya Khatun? Iraj said, She is in labor, my lord. The child is coming. And in that moment, all the grief and all the weariness and all the weight of the campaign and the journey and the loss of Boran Sahib fell away from Aladdin like dust shaken from a cloak. His face broke into a smile, the kind of smile that only comes when the Almighty reminds a man that even in the midst of death, life does not stop. He whispered, Allah, my child is coming, and he ran. He ran into the palace like a boy, like a young man who has forgotten that he is a wazir and a warrior and a leader of men, who remembers only that he is about to become a father. Behind him, Khalil stood alone in the courtyard. He looked up at the sky where the first stars were appearing like scattered embers from a distant fire. He whispered, My Allah has taken one life and given another, Subhanallah, and then he followed his brother inside. But the night was not done with its cruelties, not yet, not by far. At the Kanka, the Shahzada arrived. He came with his army spread behind him like a dark tide rolling across the land. Cavalry in the front, infantry in rows behind them, torches held aloft casting their sick orange glow upon the helmets and spear tips, and the grim faces of men who had sworn allegiance to a prince who had bathed his path to power in the blood of thousands. The hoofbeats shook the ground. The torchlight turned the walls of the Kanka into something that looked less like a place of worship, and more like the entrance to a tomb. Evernose, Fatima, and the others watched from their concealed positions. They saw the Shahzada's army spread across the approach to the Kanka like a net being drawn tight. They saw the banners, they counted the men, and what they counted turned their blood cold. Shamal whispered, This is our last chance. The Shahzada is about to reach the Kanka. Once he enters, it is over. Fatima gripped her dagger and said, We should attack. We may die, but we will not let the Shahzada breathe another day. We will end this war here, tonight. Ayaz nodded firmly and said, Fatima Khatun is right. We must strike now. There is no other way. Evernose held up his hand. His face was carved from stone. His eyes were fire beneath ice. He said, No, I trust my Sultan. If we attack now, we will be exposed. We will be outnumbered. And our Sultan will be trapped inside with no path of escape. I believe he will find his way out. I believe in him. Fatima looked at Evernose and asked the question that needed asking. And if our Sultan cannot get out, what then? Evernose met her gaze and said, Then we attack with everything we have. We fight until there is nothing left of us to fight with. But for now, we stay together, we stay silent, we move, come. And they moved, like shadows, like ghosts of warriors whose names history has not yet learned. They crept through the darkness, flanking the Kanka, positioning themselves at every possible exit, every possible breach, every possible seam in the wall through which a man and a woman might escape into the night. Inside the Kanka, Esporcha looked at Orhan Sahib and said through her tears, I cannot leave them. I cannot leave my Baba here. They will kill him. You know they will. Orhan Sahib looked at Shahanshah. He looked at the man who had once commanded armies, who had once sat upon a throne that made the earth tremble, who had once spoken and kingdoms listened. And now that man sat in a chair in a dark room in a Kanka surrounded by enemies, and he could not even lift his own hand. Orhan Sahib said he wants to stay Esporcha. They have already taken his mind. They will not take more. Come, we must go. Esporcha wept. She wept the way only those weep who are being asked to abandon the one person they came to save. She whispered, because of me you are trapped here, Orhan. Because I ran, because I came to him, because I could not bear to leave him in their hands, and now look, we are both prisoners. Orhan Sahib turned to her. His voice was steady, and in it was something that no amount of despair could extinguish. He said, a Turk is never a prisoner, and his wife never leaves him alone. Esporcha looked at him, and in that look was something that went beyond love, beyond loyalty, beyond the bond of marriage. It was the recognition that the man standing before her was not just her husband. He was the last wall between her and the abyss. She wiped her eyes and asked, then what do we do now? And it was then that Rahiba Sophia burst through the door, breathless, her face drained of color. She said, the new Shahanshah is here. He has entered the compound. His soldiers are everywhere. You must leave now. There is no more time. Orhan Sahib asked, is there another way out? A hidden passage, a back gate, anything? Sophia shook her head. There is only one exit, and it is already guarded by his men. Esporcha closed her eyes and said, then there is no escape. We are trapped. Orhan Sahib did not close his eyes. He did not despair. He stood taller. He gripped his sword, and he began to think, because men like Orhan Sahib do not surrender to circumstance. They reshape it. They bend reality to their will through sheer force of intellect and courage, the way a blacksmith bends iron through fire and hammer. He said, listen to me carefully, both of you. And what he told them, what plan he crafted in that moment of total encirclement, was something that only a mind forged in the furnace of 100 battles could have conceived. Outside, the Kanka's great doors swung open. The Shahzada rode through them on a black horse, flanked by his personal guard, his armor gleaming beneath the torchlight. He dismounted and looked around the courtyard. His eyes swept across the walls, the windows, the shadows. He saw no soldiers, no guards, nothing. The Kanka was silent as a graveyard. He turned to his commander and asked with suspicion sharpening every syllable, where are the guards? Andreas said he had arranged protection. Where are the men he posted here? Why is this place empty? The commander dismounted and placed his hand on his sword. He said, we will go first, Jahanpana. Let me secure the path ahead. And it was then that Orhan Sahib stepped out from the inner doorway and walked directly into the courtyard. He walked with the calm, measured stride of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He wore no armor. He carried no visible weapon. His clothes were those of a common soldier, unremarkable, forgettable, and that was precisely the point. The commander saw him first. He drew his sword and pointed it at Orhan Sahib's chest and said, stop, do not take another step. Identify yourself. Orhan Sahib stopped. He looked at the commander without fear. He looked at the Shahzada without recognition. And he said, my name is Clems. I am Commander Andreas's closest personal guard. I was assigned to protect this compound. Behind him, Rahiba Sophia emerged from the doorway and bowed deeply and said, great Shahanshah, we have been expecting you. I am Sophia, the head priestess of this Kanka. We are honored by your presence. The Shahzada studied Orhan Sahib's face. He studied it the way a man studies a coin he suspects might be counterfeit, turning it over in his mind, looking for the flaw, looking for the crack in the facade. Then he turned to Sophia. He looked at her robes, her veil, her deferential posture, and slowly, reluctantly, some of the suspicion drained from his face, not all of it, but enough. The commander lowered his sword. The soldiers relaxed their stances. The immediate threat receded like a wave pulling back from the shore, but everyone knew that waves return. Orhan Sahib pressed his advantage. He said, Commander Andreas told me he would be here to receive you personally, Jahanpana, but I do not see him with your entourage. Has something happened? The Shahzada's eyes flickered. He did not answer. He looked at Orhan Sahib for a long moment and then walked past him without a word, moving deeper into the Kanka, his boots ringing against the stone, his guards falling into step behind him like shadows attached to a moving flame. Outside, Evernose and his people had crept close enough to see everything through the half-open gate. They saw the Shahzada's soldiers. They saw Orhan Sahib standing among them, unarmed, disguised, alone. They saw the swords. They saw the danger. Fatima whispered with barely contained fury, it is as I feared. they have our sultan surrounded. One wrong word and they will cut him down. Evernose gripped his sword, his knuckles were white. He said, prepare to attack. If they touch him, we go in, all of us, no retreat, no hesitation. But then they watched, and what they watched was something that made even Evernose, a man who had seen the impossible made real 100 times over, pause in wonder. They watched the Shahzada's soldiers lower their weapons. They watched the tension drain from the courtyard like water through cracks in a dam. They watched Orhan Sahib speak with the Shahzada as though he were nothing more than a loyal guard, a servant of the very empire he had spent his life fighting against. Shamal leaned close to Evernose and whispered, our sultan has done it again. He has turned their suspicion into trust. He is standing in the lion's mouth and the lion does not even know it is biting air. Evernose exhaled slowly. He said, yes, but trust is a blade that cuts both ways. We remain vigilant. Shamal, take your men around the back. When our sultan comes out, and he will come out, we will be there to receive him. Go now. Shamal nodded and vanished into the darkness with his men, moving like smoke through the trees, soundless, invisible, deadly. Evernose took Fatima and the remaining soldiers and moved to a position on the opposite flank, covering the main gate, covering every possible approach, covering every angle from which danger might arrive. Inside the Khanqa, the Shahzada had moved deeper into the compound. Orhan Sahib walked behind him, playing his role with the precision of a master actor performing on a stage where the penalty for a missed line is death. The Shahzada turned and asked a question that was not really a question but a test. He said, you seem to take precautions beyond what is normal for a guard. Your soldiers, where are they? Why can I not see them? Orhan Sahib answered without hesitation. He said, gathering soldiers in the open would attract attention from every direction. My men are positioned in places where they can see everything but where no one can see them. That is the arrangement Commander Andreas and I agreed upon. Visibility invites attack. Invisibility ensures protection. The Shahzada considered this. He looked at Orhan Sahib's common clothes and said, that is why you wear no armor, no insignia. You dress as a commoner so that no one would suspect. Orhan Sahib nodded once. He said nothing more. He let the Shahzada's own mind fill in the rest, because the most effective deceptions are not the lies you tell but the truths you allow your enemy to construct for himself. The Shahzada said, I understand now why Andreas trusts you. And then Orhan Sahib took a risk, a calculated, razor-thin risk that could have unraveled everything or secured everything. He said, but even with all these precautions, Jahanpanna, someone has been trying to reach your secret prisoner. Someone is working against you from inside your own ranks. The Shahzada stopped walking. His entire body went rigid. He turned slowly and looked at Orhan Sahib with eyes that burned with sudden, consuming suspicion, but not suspicion of Orhan Sahib. Suspicion of everyone else. He whispered, who? And Orhan Sahib said nothing. He held the silence like a weapon. He let it stretch. He let it coil around the Shahzada's mind like a vine choking a pillar, because the silence was the answer. The silence told the Shahzada that this guard, this Clems, knew something so dangerous that even speaking it aloud in these corridors could get them both killed. And that silence, that deliberate, masterful silence, accomplished what 1,000 words could not. It made the Shahzada trust Orhan Sahib completely. The Shahzada stared at him for a long, long moment. And then he turned and continued walking, and his guards followed, and Orhan Sahib followed, and the Khanqa swallowed them all in its dark and ancient corridors. And outside the wolves waited, and in Bursa a child was being born, and in the heavens above the stars burned in their fixed positions like the eyes of Allah, watching his creation stumble through the darkness toward a dawn that may or may not come. And the night was not over, the war was not over. The questions remained unanswered, the traps remained unsprung. And somewhere in the shadows, between truth and deception, between the Khanqa and the palace, between the living and the dead, the fate of empires hung upon a single thread, a thread so thin that even the wind could snap it, and yet so strong that all the armies of the world could not sever it, because that thread was not made of silk or steel. It was made of faith. And faith, Nazarene, does not break. It bends, it bleeds, it burns, but it does not break. So we leave them here. Orhan Sahib walking beside the enemy who does not know he is the enemy. Sporcha hidden in the depths of the Khanqa with her shattered father. Evernose crouched in the darkness with his sword drawn and his heart pounding. Fatima watching the gate with the patience of a woman who has learned that patience is not weakness, but the most dangerous weapon a warrior can carry. Shamal moving through the back passages like a ghost. Aladdin running through the halls of Bursa toward the cries of a newborn child. Khalil standing alone in a courtyard, watching the stars, remembering the dead, praying for the living. And Shahanshah sitting in his chair, staring at nothing, whispering words that no one will hear. Words about thrones and grandsons and the terrible, beautiful, merciless turning of the wheel of time. Assalamu alaikum, Nazreen. The torchlight inside the concha moved like something alive, crawling along the damp stone walls, retreating into corners, flickering against the faces of men who carried swords and suspicion in equal measure. The Shahzada walked ahead, his boots striking the floor with the rhythm of a man who believed the world owed him every step he took upon it. Behind him, his personal guard moved in tight formation, their hands never leaving their weapons, their eyes sweeping every doorway, every shadow, every crack in the ancient walls. And behind them, walking with the measured calm of a man balancing on the edge of a blade stretched across an abyss, Orhan Sahib followed. He had given the Shahzada a name that was not his own. He had wrapped himself in the identity of a dead man, a man whose blood was still drying on the stones 3 corridors behind them. Clems. The name sat upon his tongue like poison, but he held it there because the moment demanded it, because the lives of those he loved depended upon the Shahzada never learning the truth. And so Orhan Sahib walked and watched and waited. The Shahzada stopped at the entrance to the inner courtyard. He turned his head slightly, not fully looking back, and said in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority, "Take me to the Shahanshah. I wish to see my grandfather." Orhan Sahib did not hesitate. He stepped forward and said, "Of course, Jahan Pana, this way." And he led the Shahzada deeper into the concha, through corridors he had only walked once before, corridors that Rahiba Sophia had shown him, corridors that he had memorized in a single pass, because a man who forgets the layout of a building he may need to escape from is a man who has chosen to die. They walked in silence for a time. The only sounds were boots on stone and the distant dripping of water from somewhere deep within the walls, a sound that made the concha feel less like a place of prayer and more like the belly of some ancient beast that had swallowed them all and was now slowly digesting them in darkness. Then the Shahzada spoke again. He said, "You told me someone is trying to reach my prisoner. You will tell me who, now." Orhan Sahib knew that the silence he had used as a weapon moments ago could not be used twice. A blade that cuts once can cut again, but a trick that works once will betray you if you attempt it a second time. So he answered. He said, "There have been movements in the eastern corridors that do not match any of our patrol schedules, footprints that should not exist, a door that was found unlocked when it should have been sealed. Commander Andreas believed it was one of the local monks working with outside agents. He was investigating the matter when I last received his orders." The Shahzada listened. His face revealed nothing, but his breathing changed, became slightly shallower, and Orhan Sahib noticed because Orhan Sahib noticed everything. The Shahzada said, "Andreas has always been thorough, but thorough men sometimes miss what is right in front of them because they are too busy looking behind." Orhan Sahib said nothing. He let the comment pass like a stone sinking into water. They reached the corridor that led to Shahanshah's chamber. Orhan Sahib stopped and gestured toward the door at the end of the passage. He said, "He is inside, Jahan Pana, as he has been since we brought him here. He does not speak. He does not eat unless forced. He sits and stares at the wall." The Shahzada looked at the door. For a moment, just a moment, something passed across his face that might have been human. It might have been regret. It might have been the faintest shadow of the boy he had once been. A boy who had sat upon his grandfather's knee and listened to stories of great kings and greater battles. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, crushed beneath the weight of ambition, buried beneath the mountain of corpses he had built to reach the height on which he now stood. He said, "Open it." Orhan Sahib reached for the door, and as his hand touched the wood, he calculated. He calculated the number of soldiers behind him. He calculated the distance to the nearest window. He calculated the time it would take Evernose to hear a signal if he could send one. He calculated the probability that a Sporcha had moved to the hiding place he had instructed her to reach. He calculated all of this in the span of a single heartbeat, because that was the kind of mind the Almighty had given him, a mind that worked like a siege engine, methodical, powerful, and relentless. He opened the door. The room was dim. A single oil lamp burned on a low table near the far wall, casting a circle of yellow light that barely reached the corners. And there in the center of that light sat Shahanshah. He had not moved, he had not changed. He sat in his chair like a monument to his own ruin, his hands in his lap, his eyes fixed upon a point on the wall that held no meaning except the meaning his shattered mind had assigned to it. His breathing was slow, his skin was gray. He was alive in the way that a tree is alive after the fire has passed through the forest, standing but hollowed out, waiting for the first strong wind to bring it down. The Shahzada entered the room. He walked slowly toward his grandfather. He stood over him and looked down at him and said, "Grandfather." Shahanshah did not respond. The Shahzada knelt. He brought his face close to the old man's face and said again, more softly, "Grandfather, it is me, I have come." Shahanshah's eyes did not move. His lips did not part. His fingers did not twitch. Whatever door the old man had closed inside himself, whatever wall he had built between his consciousness and the world that had destroyed him, the Shahzada's voice could not breach it. The Shahzada stood, he turned to Orhan Sahib and said, "How long has he been like this?" Orhan Sahib said, "Since before I was assigned here." Commander Andreas said the deterioration was gradual. First he stopped eating on his own, then he stopped responding to questions, then he stopped recognizing faces. Now he simply sits. The Shahzada looked at his grandfather one more time, and then he said something that revealed more about his character than 1,000 battles ever could. He said, "It does not matter. The throne does not require his mind. It only required his absence, and his absence has been secured." He turned and walked out of the room. Orhan Sahib followed, and as he crossed the threshold he glanced back at Shahanshah one final time, and in that glance was a promise. Not a promise of rescue, for rescue had already been attempted and the old man had refused to move. It was a promise of remembrance. A promise that when the histories were written, when the songs were sung, when the stories were told around campfires and in the courtyards of mosques, the name of this broken emperor would not be forgot. It would be spoken alongside the names of those who had tried to save him, and that, sometimes, is the only honor the world has left to offer. Meanwhile, in the hidden alcove behind the western wall of the Kanka, Shahzadi Esporcha sat in darkness. The alcove was barely large enough for two people, carved into the stone centuries ago by monks who had used it for solitary meditation, and now it served as the last hiding place of a princess whose world had been reduced to the space between four cold walls and the sound of her own breathing. Rahiba Sophia sat beside her. The priestess had guided Esporcha to this place moments after Orhan Sahib had given his instructions. He had spoken quickly and with absolute clarity. "Take her here. Do not move until I come for you. If I do not come by dawn, take the passage beneath the eastern chapel and go north. My people will find you. Do not look back. Do not wait. Do not hope. Just move." Esporcha had wanted to argue. She had wanted to stay by her father's side. She had wanted to fight, to take up a sword and stand beside her husband and cut down every soldier who dared to stand between them and freedom. But Orhan Sahib had looked at her with those eyes, those impossibly calm, impossibly deep eyes, and he had said, "Esporcha, trust me," and she had trusted him. Because in all the years of their union, in all the trials and battles and separations and reunions, he had never once given her a reason not to. Now she sat in the dark and listened. She listened to footsteps passing in the corridor outside. She listened to the muffled voices of soldiers she could not see. She listened to the beating of her own heart, which sounded in that silence like a drum announcing the approach of an army, and she prayed. She prayed not for herself, not for her own safety, not for her own life, but for the man who was at this very moment walking among wolves in the clothing of a shepherd, risking everything he was and everything he would ever be for her sake. Sophia reached out in the darkness and took Esporcha's hand. She held it firmly and whispered, "He will come. I have seen the way he moves, the way he speaks, the way he reads a room before anyone else, and it has even begun to understand what they are looking at. He will come." Esporcha squeezed the priestess's hand and said nothing, because sometimes silence is the only prayer that the heart knows how to offer. Outside the Kanka, the positions had shifted. Evernose had moved his people into a tighter formation around the compound. They were close now, close enough to hear the Shahzada's horses breathing, close enough to smell the smoke from the torches, close enough to see the glint of steel beneath the orange glow. Tamir Boga crouched beside Evernose, his massive frame somehow folded into the shadow of a collapsed wall, his hand wrapped around the handle of his battle axe, his jaw grinding with the effort of restraint. Tamir Boga whispered, "How much longer, Evernose? My arms ache for the swing, my blade thirsts." Evernose said, "Your blade will drink its fill before this night is done, but not yet, not yet." Fatima was behind them, positioned between two of their best archers. She had exchanged her dagger for a short sword taken from one of the soldiers, and she held it with the familiarity of a woman who had trained in secret since childhood, who had swung a blade before she had learned to braid her own hair. She said, "The Shahzada's men are spreading out. They are sending patrols around the perimeter. If they come this way, they will find us." Evernose said, "Then we deal with them quietly. No sound, no alarm. Mustafa, take 3 men and intercept any patrol that moves toward our eastern position. Do it silently. If even one of them calls out, we are finished." Mustafa nodded and vanished with 3 soldiers into the underbrush. They moved like water through cracks in stone, filling every gap, passing through every space, leaving no trace. Shamal, who had circled the entire compound by now, returned from the rear. He approached Evernose low and fast and reported in a whisper that was barely louder than the wind. He said, "There is a small gate on the northern wall. It is unguarded. The Shahzada's men have not found it. If our Sultan can reach it from inside, he can exit unseen." Evernose looked at him. He said, "Can you hold that gate?" Jamal said, "With my life." Evernose said, "Then go, hold it, let no one close it, let no one guard it. When our Sultan comes, and he will come, that is where he will emerge." Jamal gripped Evernose's forearm in the way of warriors and then disappeared again into the night. Evernose turned back to the Conca and watched and waited and prayed beneath his breath, words that no one could hear, words that were not meant for human ears. Inside the Conca, the Shahzada had returned to the main courtyard. He sat upon a stone bench near the fountain that had long since stopped flowing and summoned his commander to his side. He said, "I want this compound searched. Every room, every corridor, every cellar, every attic, every crack in every wall. My grandfather is secure, but I am not satisfied that this place is clean. There are too many shadows, too many closed doors." The commander bowed and said, "It will be done, Jahan Pana. I will send men through every section." The Shahzada said, "And find Andreas. I want to know why he is not here. He was supposed to receive me. His absence makes me uneasy." The commander said, "Perhaps he is on his way." The Shahzada said, "Perhaps, and perhaps he is lying in a ditch with his throat opened. In this world, one must prepare for both possibilities with equal seriousness. Go." The commander turned and began organizing his men into search parties. Teams of 3 and 4 soldiers spread out through the Conca, opening doors, overturning tables, dragging curtains aside, peering into every dark corner with torches held high and swords held higher. Orhan Sahib watched this from his position near the courtyard entrance. He knew that time was running out. The search would reach the western alcove eventually. The search would find Esporcha. The search would find Sophia. And when it did, the entire deception would collapse like a bridge built on sand, and the swords that were currently sheathed would be drawn, and the blood that was currently contained would be spilled. He needed to move, now. He approached the Shahzada and said, "Jahan Pana, if you will permit me, I will personally oversee the search of the western wing. It is the oldest part of the compound and the most difficult to navigate. My men know its layout better than anyone." The Shahzada looked at him, that calculating gaze again, that gaze that weighed every word on the scales of suspicion. Then he nodded and said, "Go, but report to me the moment you find anything." Orhan Sahib bowed and walked away. He walked calmly. He walked at the pace of a man carrying out an order, not the pace of a man running for his life. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was racing. Every corridor he passed, every corner he turned, every second that elapsed was a second closer to discovery. A second closer to the moment when a soldier would open the wrong door and find a princess who should not be there and a guard who was not who he claimed to be. He reached the western wing. The corridors here were narrower, older, the stones darker and rougher, the air colder. He moved quickly now, no longer needing to maintain appearances, no longer being watched by the Shahzada's men. He turned left, then right, then left again, following the path Sophia had shown him, counting doors, counting steps, counting heartbeats. He reached the alcove. He pressed his hand against the stone panel and pushed. It slid inward with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Inside, 2 pairs of eyes looked up at him from the darkness. Esporcha's eyes, Sophia's eyes, relief and fear in equal measure. He said, "We go now. There is a gate on the northern wall. My people are waiting outside. Stay close, stay silent, move when I move, stop when I stop." Esporcha stood. She looked at him and said, "My father." He said, "Esporcha, your father made his choice. He will not move, and we cannot carry him through corridors crawling with soldiers. He is safer where he is. The Shahzada wants him alive. He needs him alive. Without Shahanshah, the Shahzada's claim to legitimacy crumbles. Your father will not be harmed." She closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and opened her eyes and said, "Then let us go." They moved through the western wing like 3 shadows stitched together by urgency. Orhan Sahib led, his sword drawn now, his body coiled, every muscle ready to explode into violence at the first sign of contact. Sophia followed, her robes gathered up in her hands to prevent them from dragging against the floor and making sound. Esporcha came last, her jaw set, her hands clenched, her grief packed away into a compartment of her heart that she would not open again until she was safe enough to weep. They passed through a narrow passage that connected the western wing to the northern section of the compound. The passage was unlit. They moved by touch, by memory, by instinct. The walls were close enough that Orhan Sahib could feel the damp stone on both shoulders as he moved. The ceiling was low enough that he had to bend. The floor was uneven, cracked, treacherous. One wrong step would send a stone clattering into the darkness and bring every soldier in the Conca running. They reached the end of the passage. A wooden door, old and warped, stood between them and the northern courtyard. Orhan Sahib pressed his ear against it and listened. He heard nothing. He waited. He listened again, still nothing. He gripped the iron handle and pulled. The door groaned. He pulled harder. It opened. Beyond the door was a small, overgrown courtyard that had clearly not been used in years. Weeds pushed up between the flagstones. A broken fountain sat in one corner covered in moss, and beyond the courtyard, set into the northern wall, was a gate. A small, iron-banded gate barely large enough for a man to pass through without ducking. And standing beside that gate, barely visible in the darkness, was Shamal. He had his sword in one hand and a look of fierce determination on his face that could have frightened the stars themselves. When he saw Orhan Sahib emerge from the doorway, his expression changed. Relief flooded his features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He stepped forward and whispered, "Sultan, Alhamdulillah, we are here. Evernoz and the others are outside. Horses are ready. Come." Orhan Sahib nodded. He turned to Sophia and said, "You have risked your life for us. You will not be forgotten. Come with us. There is nothing left for you here but danger." Sophia shook her head. She said, "This Kanka is my home. These walls have sheltered me since I was a girl. I will not abandon them. And besides, if I disappear, the Shahzada will know immediately that someone helped you escape. If I remain, I can tell them that I saw nothing, heard nothing, know nothing. My presence here is your protection even after you are gone." Orhan Sahib looked at her for a long moment. Then he placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head and said, "May Allah protect you, Sophia. Whatever faith you follow, whatever name you give to the one who watches over us all, may he keep you safe within these walls." Sophia smiled, a sad, tired, beautiful smile, and then she turned and disappeared back into the passage, and the darkness closed behind her like a curtain falling at the end of a scene that the audience will never forget. Orhan Sahib took Esporcha's hand. They moved through the gate. Shamal went first, then Esporcha, then Orhan Sahib. The gate opened onto a narrow path that ran along the outside of the northern wall, bordered on one side by the Kanka's stone facade and on the other by dense undergrowth that clawed at their clothes and scratched at their faces as they pushed through it. They moved quickly now. There was no need for deception out here. Out here, speed was their only ally. They followed the path for perhaps 100 yards before it opened into a small clearing where Evernoz was waiting with horses and soldiers. When Evernoz saw Orhan Sahib, he did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply stood taller, sheathed his sword, and said in a voice thick with emotion that he would never allow to surface fully, "Sultan, you are safe." Orhan Sahib said, "For now, but the Shahzada's men will discover our escape soon. We must ride before they do." Fatima rushed forward and embraced Esporcha. She held her tightly and whispered, "Sister, thank Allah, you are safe." Esporcha returned the embrace but said nothing. Her eyes were dry now. She had moved beyond tears into that cold, clear space where grief becomes resolve and resolve becomes something harder than steel. Tamir Boga brought the horses forward. Orhan Sahib mounted in a single fluid motion. Esporcha mounted behind him. Evernoz mounted his own horse. Fatima, Shamal, Tamir Boga, Mustafa, Ayaz, all of them mounted and formed up around their sultan like a living wall of loyalty and blade. Orhan Sahib looked back at the Kanka one final time. Its dark walls rose against the night sky like the ribs of a dead beast. Somewhere inside, Shahanshah sat in his chair, staring at his wall, speaking to ghosts. Somewhere inside, Sophia moved through empty corridors, preparing her lies, fortifying her mask, becoming once again the obedient priestess who saw nothing and knew nothing. And somewhere inside, the Shahzada was about to discover that his prisoner's rescuer had been standing beside him the entire time, speaking to him, advising him, leading him through his own compound like a blind man led through a maze by the very person who built it. Orhan Sahib turned his horse and said, "Ride." And they rode through the darkness with the speed of men who knew that dawn would bring pursuit. They rode through forests where the branches reached for them like the fingers of the dead. They rode across streams that glittered like scattered coins beneath the starlight. They rode until the Kanka was nothing but a memory swallowed by distance and darkness, until the only sounds were hoofbeats and breathing and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. As they rode, Evernoz brought his horse alongside Orhan Sahib's and said, "The Shahzada is not a fool. He will piece together what happened. He will realize that Clems is dead and that the man who stood before him was someone else entirely. And when he does, his fury will be something the world has not seen since the old wars." Orhan Sahib said, "Let him rage. Rage without intelligence is noise. Rage with intelligence is dangerous. But the Shahzada's intelligence is poisoned by his arrogance, and arrogance is the truest blindness a man can suffer." Fatima rode up on the other side and said, "What about Shahanshah? We left him behind. Will they harm him?" Orhan Sahib said, "The Shahzada needs the Shahanshah. A throne without legitimacy is just a chair. Shahanshah is the source of that legitimacy, even in his broken state. The Shahzada will keep him alive because keeping him alive serves his ambition. Killing him would destroy the very foundation upon which his stolen crown sits. Isporcha, seated behind Orhan Sahib, tightened her grip around his waist. She pressed her face against his back and said nothing. But he felt her tears soaking through the fabric of his cloak, warm and silent and ceaseless, the tears of a daughter who had gone to save her father and returned with nothing but the knowledge that some chains cannot be broken by swords alone. They rode for hours. The night began to fade. The eastern sky turned from black to from gray to the faintest suggestion of gold, from gold to the pale, cold blue of a winter dawn. The forest thinned, the ground rose. They crested a ridge and Orhan Sahib pulled his horse to a stop and looked out over the land that stretched before them. A vast, rolling expanse of hills and valleys and rivers that glinted like veins of silver in the early light. He said to no one in particular, and yet to everyone who could hear, "We have purchased one night, one escape, one breath, but the war continues. The Shahzada sits upon a throne he stole with blood. Shahanshah rots in a khanqa that has become his prison. Andreas moves in the shadows, weaving alliances and conspiracies that stretch across borders and boundaries like spider silk stretched between pillars. And somewhere in all of this there is a path forward, a path to justice. A path to the restoration of what has been broken and the punishment of what has been corrupted. I do not see that path yet, but I know it exists, because Allah does not create injustice without also creating the means to destroy it. He does not allow darkness to reign without hiding, somewhere within that darkness, the spark that will eventually consume it." Everno said, "Where do we go now, Sultan?" Orhan Sahib said to Bursa, "There is much to be done and much to be answered for." He thought of his children. He thought of Qasim and Suleiman and Gulsum and the confession they had made to Malhan Khatan. He thought of the disobedience and the consequences and the conversations that would need to be had, conversations that would be harder than any battle he had ever fought, because a sword can defeat an enemy, but only wisdom can guide a child, and wisdom, unlike steel, cannot be sharpened on a stone. It must be forged slowly, painfully, through years of experience and failure and prayer. He thought of Aladdin. He thought of Ganya Khatan and the child that was being born even as he sat upon this horse on this ridge in this cold dawn. He thought of Boran Sahib, dead now, gone from this world, his kappas silent, his songs unfinished. He thought of Khalil, standing alone in that courtyard, looking up at the stars, carrying the grief of a lost friend with the quiet dignity that was his nature. He thought of all of them, all of his people, all of the lives that were tangled together like threads in a carpet whose pattern he could not yet see but whose beauty he believed in with every fiber of his being. And then he turned his horse toward Bursa and rode. Behind him, his people followed. Evernoz and Fatima, Shamal and Tamir Boga, Mustafa and Ayaz, and all the soldiers whose names would never appear in the great chronicles but whose blood had purchased every victory and whose courage had held the line when all seemed lost. And behind them, far behind them now, the Shahzada's voice could be heard, rising from the khanqa like smoke from a fire, screaming orders, screaming questions, screaming the name Clems over and over as his soldiers searched every room and every corridor and every crack in every wall and found nothing but empty shadows and the cold, mocking echo of their own footsteps. And in Bursa, as the dawn light crept through the palace windows and fell upon the face of Ganya Khatan, who lay exhausted but alive in her bed with a newborn child cradled against her chest, Aladdin Sahib knelt beside her and wept. He wept not from sorrow but from the overwhelming, crushing, beautiful weight of gratitude. He looked at his child and whispered, "You have come into a world that is burning. But I swear to you by the one who created us all, I will build for you a world that is worth inheriting. I will fight for it, I will bleed for it, I will die for it if I must, but you will not grow up in ashes, you will grow up in gardens, this I promise you." Malhan Khatan stood in the doorway and watched. Her face was stern but her eyes were wet. She had not yet finished with the children. She had not yet delivered the reckoning that Qasim and Suleiman and Gulsum deserved for their role in Isporcha's escape. But that could wait. This moment, this fragile, sacred, unrepeatable moment of a new life entering the world, this could not wait. This demanded witness. This demanded silence. This demanded that every grievance and every grudge and every unresolved anger be set aside, if only for the span of a few breaths, in honor of the miracle that the Almighty had placed before them. Nilofer stood beside Malhan. She looked at the child and then she looked at Malhan and said, "Allah gives and Allah takes, and in between the giving and the taking, he reminds us why we fight." Malhan nodded slowly and said, "Yes, he does." And outside the palace in the courtyard where the horses were tied and the weapons were stacked and the soldiers were resting between one battle and the next, Khalil sat alone on a stone bench and held Boran Sahib's kappas in his hands. He ran his fingers over the strings. He did not play, he simply held it, the way one holds a memory, carefully, reverently, knowing that once you set it down, something will be lost that can never be recovered. He whispered, "Old friend, you sang the songs that made us brave. You played the melodies that turned frightened boys into fearless men. You You carried the music of our ancestors in your hands the way other men carry swords, and now your hands are still, and the music waits for someone else to carry it forward. I do not know if I am worthy, but I will try. In your name and in the name of Allah, I will try. And somewhere on the road between the Kanka and Bursa, as the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened and the world revealed itself in all its harsh and beautiful detail, Orhan Sahib rode in silence. The Sporcher rode behind him, her arms around him, her face against his back, her breathing steady now, her tears dried, her grief packed away but not gone, never gone, simply stored in that deep place where all impossible sorrows are kept by those who must keep moving because the alternative is to lie down and never rise again. Evernos rode beside them. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mission had been accomplished and the mission had failed. They had rescued a Sporcha. They had not rescued Shahanshah. They had penetrated the Shahzada's compound and escaped with their lives. But the Shahzada still sat upon his stolen throne. Andreas still moved in the shadows. The enemies of justice still breathed and plotted and sharpened their blades in the darkness. The war was not over. It was merely entering its next phase. And that phase, Nazreen, would be darker and bloodier and more treacherous than anything that had come before. Because now the Shahzada knew. He knew that someone had walked into his fortress disguised as his own man and walked out with the very prisoner he was trying to control. He knew that he had been deceived. And a man like the Shahzada, a man who had killed thousands to reach the pinnacle of power, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty, a man who viewed mercy as weakness and compassion as a disease, such a man does not suffer deception quietly. He would respond. He would respond with fire and iron and the full terrible weight of an empire turned toward vengeance. He would send armies. He would send assassins. He would send spies and saboteurs and agents of chaos into every corner of Orhan Sahib's world. He would not rest until the scales were balanced, until the humiliation was repaid, until the man who had stood beside him and lied to his face was brought before him in chains and forced to kneel. And Orhan Sahib knew this. He knew it the way a sailor knows a storm is coming, by the feel of the wind, by the color of the sky, by the deepening silence that precedes the thunder. He knew it, and he did not fear it. Because fear is a luxury that leaders cannot afford, and Orhan Sahib was a leader, not by the accident of birth or the inheritance of title, but by the quality of his soul, by the depth of his faith, by the unwavering conviction that the path he walked was the path that Allah had laid before him, and that every obstacle upon that path was not a barrier but a test, and every test was not a punishment but a refinement, and every refinement brought him closer to the man he was meant to become. He rode toward Bursa. He rode toward his people. He rode toward the next battle and the next crisis and the next impossible choice. He rode toward the future, not knowing what it held, not knowing whether it would bring victory or defeat, not knowing whether the dawn that was breaking around him now was the dawn of triumph or the dawn of ruin. But he rode. Because that is what men of faith do. They ride, they fight, they fall, they rise, they ride again. And they do not stop until the journey is done, until the last breath has been drawn, until the final word has been spoken, until the account has been settled between them and their Creator. And the account, Nazreen, is never settled in this world. It is only settled in the next, and until that day comes, the ride continues. The swords remain sharp. The prayers remain constant. The fire remains lit. And the war, the great and terrible and sacred war between justice and tyranny, between truth and deception, between those who build and those who destroy, that war goes on. It goes on in the corridors of the Kanka where Sophia walks alone, keeping secrets that could cost her life. It goes on in the chamber where Shahanshah stares at his wall, lost in the wreckage of his own mind. It goes on in the courtyard of Bursa where Kala holds a dead man's instrument and wonders if the music will ever sound the same. It goes on in the room where Ganya holds her newborn child and whispers prayers into tiny ears that have never heard the sound of war. It goes on in the hearts of Qasim and Suleiman and Gulsum, who have learned, too young and too harshly, that actions have consequences and that love, even love, can lead to choices that cannot be undone. And it goes on in the heart of Orhan Sahib, who rides through the morning light with his wife's arms around him and his sword at his side, and his faith burning inside him like a flame that no wind, no rain, no army, no empire can extinguish. Because that flame is not his, it belongs to Allah, and what belongs to Allah cannot be destroyed. Trees. The undergrowth tore at their clothes and scratched their skin and tried to trip them with hidden roots and fallen branches, but they pushed through it, driven by the urgency that comes from knowing that every second is the difference between escape and capture, between freedom and death. Behind them the first shout went up, a voice, loud, angry, panicked, the prisoner is gone, sound the alarm, find them now. And then the forest erupted, torches flared to life, Horses were mounted, orders were screamed into the darkness. The calm, quiet camp that had been drowsing in the warmth of its fires was suddenly a hive of violent activity. Soldiers scrambling for their weapons, commanders bellowing contradictory instructions, the whole machine of military pursuit grinding into motion with the brutal efficiency of men who know that failure means punishment and possibly death. But Halima had planned for this. She had planned for the pursuit, planned for the chaos, planned for the moment when the enemy would realize what had happened and come after them with everything they had. And her plan was simple, because the best plans are always simple. She led them to the river. It was not a large river, not the kind of river that appears on maps and has a name that poets invoke, but it was deep enough and fast enough and cold enough to serve her purpose. It flowed through the forest in a winding course, its banks steep and rocky, its current strong enough to carry a person downstream at a speed that horses could not match on the rough ground of the forest floor. Into the water Halima commanded, "Follow the current, do not fight it, let it carry you, we will meet at the bend where the old oak grows, you know the place, go." And they went. One by one they lowered themselves into the cold, dark water and let the current take them, their bodies disappearing into the river like stones dropped into ink, silent, invisible, gone. Darsoon was the last. He stood on the bank, shivering, his wounds stinging in the cold air, and he looked at Halima with eyes that held something more than gratitude, something deeper, something that transcended the ordinary bonds of alliance and strategy and duty. "You came for me," he said. "Of course I came for you," Halima said. "Now get in the water, we do not have time for speeches." And Darsoon, despite everything, despite the pain and the cold and the fear and the sound of pursuing soldiers crashing through the forest behind them, smiled. A small smile, a brief smile, the kind of smile that appears on the face of a man who has remembered in the worst moment of his life that he is not alone. He entered the water, the current seized him, he was gone. Halima stood on the bank for one more moment, listening to the pursuit, gauging the distance, calculating the time. And then she too stepped into the river, and the cold water closed over her feet and her legs and her waist, and the current pulled her forward, and the forest and the camp and the torches and the shouting soldiers receded behind her, and the only sound was the rush of water and the beating of her own heart and the whispered prayer that moved on her lips like the name of someone she loved. And in the monastery, in the narrow room where an emperor lay dying, Sophia appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling. "Princess," she said, "the soldiers are returning, you must leave. Now, if they find you here, they will kill us both." Esportia did not move, her hand was still holding her father's hand, her tears were still falling on his skin. "Go," the emperor said, "go, my child, go back to your husband, go back to your life. Do not throw it away for an old man who has already spent his." "Baba," she began. "Go," he said again, and this time there was iron in his voice, the iron of a man who has given orders to armies and expects them to be obeyed, even now, even here, even lying on a deathbed in a cold stone room in a monastery at the edge of the world. Esportia leaned forward and pressed her lips against her father's forehead, and the kiss was a promise and a farewell and a declaration of war all in one, because Esportia was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat, and this was not the end, and she would return, and when she returned, she would not come alone. She rose, she turned, she walked out of the room without looking back, because if she looked back, she would not be able to leave, and she had to leave, and she knew it, and the knowing was a blade that cut deeper than any sword. Sophia led her back through the hidden passage, back through the narrow corridor behind the tapestry, back through the darkness and the silence and the smell of old stone and older prayers. They moved quickly, urgently, because the soldiers were returning to their posts and the window of escape was closing with every passing second. They reached the outer wall. Sophia pointed to a small door, half hidden behind a vine-covered trellis, a door that led to the outside, to the forest, to the darkness where Esportia's horse might still be wandering. "Go," Sophia said, "go and do not come back, not until you can come back with an army at your back and justice in your hand." Esportia looked at the nun one last time. "Thank you," she said, "I will not forget this, and I will not forget you." And then she was through the door, and the cold night air hit her face, and the forest opened before her like a dark mouth, and she ran into it, ran toward the sound of water, ran toward the smell of horses, ran toward whatever fate was waiting for her in the darkness. She found her horse. It was standing at the edge of the forest, its reins trailing on the ground, its ears pricked forward, its eyes wide with the nervous energy of an animal that has been left alone in a strange place. She mounted quickly, gathered the reins, turned the horse toward the coast, and rode. She rode through the forest as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the canopy. She rode past sleeping villages and silent farms and the ruins of old Roman fortifications that stood like the bones of a dead civilization, their walls crumbling, their gates broken, their purpose forgot. She rode until the forest thinned and the ground sloped downward and the smell of salt water filled her nostrils, and there on the shore she saw the ship. It was anchored in a small bay, its sails furled, its hull dark against the pale water. And on the shore, standing with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, was Sultan Orhan Sahib. He had arrived before her. He had sailed through the night, had navigated the currents and the winds and the dangers of Byzantine waters, and he was here waiting, watching the forest from which she would emerge, knowing that she would emerge because he knew her better than she knew herself, knew that she would not stay at the monastery, knew that she would come back, knew that the woman he had married was many things, reckless, proud, fierce, stubborn, but she was not a coward and she was not a traitor. And she would return to face whatever judgment awaited her. Sportia reined in her horse at the edge of the beach. She sat there for a moment, looking down at her husband from the height of the saddle, and he looked up at her, and the distance between them was not just the 20 paces of sand that separated their bodies, but the immense, invisible distance of pride and pain, and the things that had been said and the things that had not been said, and the decisions that had been made without consultation, and the consequences that would follow those decisions like shadows follow the sun. And then as Sportia dismounted, she walked toward her husband. Her steps were steady, her back was straight, her eyes did not waver. She stopped in front of him, she did not bow, she did not apologize, she did not weep. She stood before him as an equal, as a princess, as a woman who had done what she believed was right and was prepared to accept whatever came next. "My father is dying," she said. And Orhan Sahib looked at her for a long time, and in that look was everything: anger, love, disappointment, admiration, the terrible complexity of a heart that is pulled in too many directions at once. "I know," he said. And then silence, the sound of the waves on the shore, the cry of a seabird in the gray sky, the breathing of the horse, the breathing of the world. And behind them on the ship, Evernos stood watching, and Khalil stood watching, and the soldiers stood watching. And all of them understood that they were witnessing something that was not a battle and not a negotiation, but something more intimate and more dangerous than either. The reckoning between two people who love each other and have hurt each other, and must now decide whether the love is strong enough to survive the hurt. "You left without my permission," Orhan Sahib said, and the words were not accusatory but measured, the words of a man who is stating facts rather than making judgments, laying out the pieces on the board before deciding which move to make. "I left to save my father," Sportia said. "You are my wife," Orhan Sahib said. "You are the mother of my child. You carry the honor of my house on your shoulders. When you ride out alone into enemy territory, you risk not just your own life but the life of everyone who depends on you, everyone who loves you, everyone who would march into fire to bring you back." Sportia's jaw tightened. "And what would you have done," she asked, "if it were your father? If Ertugrul Ghazi were lying in a prison, sick, alone, abandoned by the world, with no one to hold his hand and no one to close his eyes when the end came, would you have sat in your palace and waited? Would you have asked permission?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread, and Orhan Sahib felt its edge. Because the answer was no, he would not have waited, he would not have asked permission, he would have ridden out with fire in his veins and steel in his hand and God on his lips, and he would have torn the walls down with his bare hands if necessary. And Sportia knew this, and he knew that she knew it, and they both stood there in that knowledge, in that uncomfortable truth, and neither of them looked away. "We will speak of this later," Orhan Sahib said finally. "Board the ship, we sail with the tide." And Sportia boarded the ship, and the ship raised its anchor, and the sails caught the morning wind. And the shore receded behind them, and the monastery grew small in the distance, and the emperor lay in his narrow bed in his narrow room, and the waves carried them forward, toward home, toward war, toward whatever was waiting for them on the other side of the water. And in the forest, far from the coast, far from the monastery, far from the ship and its passengers and their tangled, bleeding hearts, Halima Cotton pulled herself out of the river. She was soaked, shivering, her clothes heavy with water, her hair plastered to her skull, her skin blue with cold. But she was alive, and Darsoon was alive, and the Bazian were alive, and the mission, against all odds, against all reason, against every prediction that common sense could make, the mission had succeeded. They gathered at the bend in the river where the old oak grew, the oak that had been a landmark for generations, its trunk thick as a fortress wall, its branches spreading like the arms of a mother reaching for her children. They came out of the water one by one, gasping, trembling, dragging themselves onto the bank and lying in the mud and the leaves, their bodies spent, their spirits soaring. Darsoon sat with his back against the oak and looked at Halima with the eyes of a man who has been reborn. "You risked everything," he said. "We risk everything every day," Halima replied. "That is what it means to be alive. Now catch your breath. We have a long walk ahead of us, and the enemy will not stop searching until they find us or give up, and Damerhan does not give up." She was right. Even now, in the forest behind them, the pursuit continued. Torches moved through the trees like angry fireflies, and the sound of shouting reached them faintly on the wind, and the drumming of hooves on soft ground told them that the horsemen were still searching, still casting their net wider and wider, still refusing to accept that their prisoner had escaped from under their noses. But the river had done its work. The current had carried them downstream, away from the camp, away from the search radius, away from the place where Dame Orhan's men expected to find them. And now they were on the far side of the water, on ground that the pursuers had not yet reached, in a part of the forest that was known only to those who had lived here all their lives, the woodcutters and the hunters and the hermits and the women of the Bazian, who had mapped every tree and every stone and every hidden path in these woods as part of their training. Halima led them south. They moved slowly, carefully, avoiding the road, staying under the canopy, using the forest itself as a shield. Darsoon walked with difficulty, his injuries slowing him, his body protesting every step, but he walked because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant capture, and capture meant death, and Darsoon had too much still to do, too much still to say, too many enemies still to face, to allow death to claim him in a forest in the middle of the night. As they walked, as the forest thinned and the sky lightened and the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, Halima told Darsoon what had happened in his absence. She told him about the fall of Shahanshah, about the coup in Constantinople, about the new emperor and the new alliances and the new threats that were gathering on every horizon. She told him about Esporcha's flight and the Sultan's pursuit and the growing tension between Dame Orhan and Shahanshah, and the fragile, fractured state of the coalition that opposed Orhan Sahib's growing power. And Darsoon listened, and as he listened, the pieces fell into place in his mind. The strategic pieces, the political pieces, the human pieces, and a picture began to form. A picture of the world as it was and the world as it could be. And in that picture he saw both danger and opportunity, both destruction and creation, both the end of one era and the beginning of another. "Halima Khatun," he said when she had finished, "you have saved more than my life tonight. You have saved the cause, because I carry information that Orhan Sahib must hear. Information about Dame Orhan's true plans, information about the alliance between Shahanshah and the new emperor, information that will change everything." "Then we must move faster," Halima said. "Tell me as we walk, and let your words be as sharp as your sword, because the time for blunt speech has passed." And they walked on, deeper into the forest, deeper into the dawn, deeper into the story that was still being written, that was still unfolding, that was still reaching toward a conclusion that none of them could see but all of them could feel. The way you feel a storm approaching before the first drop of rain falls. The way you feel the earth trembling before the earthquake splits the ground. The way you feel the presence of destiny before it arrives and changes everything and leaves nothing as it was. And far away on the dark water, the ship carrying Sultan Orhan Sahib sailed toward home. And on its deck, separated by the space of a few feet that felt like the space of 1,000 miles, Orhan Sahib and Esporcha stood in silence, looking out at different parts of the same sea, thinking different thoughts about the same future, carrying different wounds from the same night. And Evernos watched them both, and he understood what he was seeing, and he said nothing, because some things are beyond the reach of words, and some wounds can only be healed by time, and some distances can only be crossed by forgiveness. And forgiveness, true forgiveness, is the hardest thing in the world to give and the most valuable thing in the world to receive. And the ship sailed on. And the forest breathed. And the river flowed. And the war waited. It waited with the patience of stone. It waited with the hunger of wolves. It waited with the certainty of sunrise, because sunrise always comes, no matter how dark the night, and war always comes, no matter how loud the prayers for peace. And in the distance, barely visible against the pale sky, the star called Zura, the star called Phosphorus, the star called Venus, the evening star, the morning star, the star that means both endings and beginnings, flickered once and then was lost in the growing light of dawn. But it was not gone, it was only hidden. And it would return as it always returned, as the night always returned, as the war always returned, as the story always returned to the place where it began, which was the place where it would end, which was the heart of a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and the love of a woman in his chest, and the will of God in his hands. And the war was not over. The alliances had not yet been sealed. The betrayals had not yet been committed. The swords had not yet been drawn for the final time. The prayers had not yet been answered. And somewhere in the forest, Dame Orhan sat alone in the ruins of his camp, his wound throbbing, his prisoner gone, his pride shattered, his rage building like water behind a dam, and he whispered a name into the darkness, the same name he always whispered, the name that had become his prayer and his curse and his reason for breathing. Orhan. And the forest heard him, and the darkness heard him, and the war heard him. And the war smiled, because the war knew what was coming. And what was coming would shake the earth.